Stalin. A name that still triggers fear, power, and contradiction today. For some, he was the man who turned the Soviet Union into a superpower and defeated Hitler's Germany. For others, he was a brutal dictator, responsible for terror, famine, camps, purges, and the deaths of millions of people. But how did a poor boy from Georgia become one of the most powerful and feared men of the 20th century? Was Stalin an unscrupulous man of power from the beginning, or did he only become what he later was through revolution, civil war, and political intrigues? And why did he succeed in eliminating even dangerous rivals like Trotsky, even though they initially seemed much better known and influential? Write me your opinion in the comments. Was Stalin above all a skillful strategist, a brutal tyrant, or both at the same time? I'm curious to see what you think of this character in the story. If you are interested in historical topics and want to understand how power, ideology, and fear can change entire societies, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. In this video, we look not only at dates and events, but at the mechanisms behind Stalin's rise: violence, propaganda, betrayal, fear, and the insatiable hunger for control. Because Stalin's story is not just the story of a single man. It is also a warning of what can happen when political power knows no bounds. Chapter 1: The Boy from Gori. Before Joseph Stalin became one of the most powerful and feared men of the 20th century, he was a child in a small town on the edge of the Russian Empire. His birthplace was Gori, a city in Georgia nestled between mountains, old churches, narrow streets, and a world far removed from the palaces of power in St. Petersburg or the political salons of Europe. He was born here on December 18, 1878, according to the Julian calendar used in Russia at the time, on December 6. His birth name was Iosif Vissarionovich Dzugashvili. The world later knew him by a different name, Stalin, the Man of Steel. But this name was still in the future. In the beginning there was a boy his mother called So-So. Gori was not a place where great political careers were expected. The city was located in a region that was itself marked by tensions. Georgia was part of the Russian Empire, but Georgian culture, language, and identity remained alive. Many people lived in simple conditions. Crafts, small traders, church and family determined everyday life. The Tsarist Empire seemed both near and far at the same time. Closed because its officials, schools, and laws determined life. Distant because many Georgians did not feel part of this Russian order. Already in this environment, the young Stalin became acquainted with a world in which power was not neutral. Power spoke a different language, often came from outside, and could determine the lives of ordinary people. His father, Vissarion Dzugashvili, was a shoemaker. He came from a humble background and worked hard, but his life was marked by failure, alcohol, and bitterness. Initially, he ran a small workshop, but later his situation deteriorated. The family lived poorly, and tensions in the house increased. Vissarion was a violent man who beat his wife and son. For little So-So, the parental home meant not only protection, but also fear. Many accounts of Stalin's childhood describe an atmosphere of harshness in which affection was rare and violence could be part of everyday life. Such experiences not only explain what later became of him, but they do show the soil from which his character grew. He learned early on that weakness could be dangerous and that the stronger often got what he wanted. His mother, Ketevangelads, usually called Kiki, was deeply religious and had high hopes for her only surviving son. Several of her children had died young, and So-So became the center of her life. She worked as a seamstress and laundress to give him a better future. While the father often appears as a destructive force, the mother was a woman of iron perseverance. She wanted her son to become a priest. For a poor family in Georgia, the church could mean a way out of poverty and insecurity. A priest enjoyed respect, education, and a secure position. Kiki did not see her son as a future revolutionary, but as a servant of God, perhaps even a man who could rise above the misery of his origins through faith and education. The young So-So was not physically free of suffering. As a child, he contracted smallpox, which left scars on his face. In addition, one of his arms later had limited mobility, probably as a result of an injury or illness. These physical traces accompanied him throughout his life. They didn't make him helpless, but they shaped his self-image in a world where strength, masculinity, and toughness meant a lot. Anyone who is ridiculed or underestimated as a child sometimes develops a special hunger for recognition. In Stalin's case, this hunger was later combined with mistrust, ambition, and a deep need for control. At school, Soso showed himself to be a gifted student. He learned quickly, had a good memory, and stood out for his discipline. The church school in Gori was strict. Their education was not only encouragement, but also subordination. The students had to obey, pray, learn by heart, and submit to an authority that hardly tolerated dissent. Education and religion were closely linked. For Soso, this school meant advancement, but also a new form of control. Those who came from poor backgrounds had to prove themselves. Any mistake could be shameful. Every good performance was a step out of the narrow milieu of his origins. But it was precisely in this religious environment that something began to take shape that would later be directed against any religious order. The young Stalin learned how institutions work. He saw how teachers and clergy exercised power, how rules shape people, and how language, rituals, and discipline can hold a community together. Later, he was to use these mechanisms not for the church, but for the party. Stalinism also had rituals, dogmas, sacred texts, enemy images, and an almost religious veneration of the leader. The roots of this understanding of order, obedience, and ideology lay not only in Marxist books, but also in the early experiences of a boy raised in a strictly religious world. Soso was also influenced by Georgian culture. He read poems, became interested in literature, and later wrote verses himself. This hardly fits the image of the cold dictator that many have in their heads. But it is precisely this early page that shows that Stalin was not born a ready-made monster. He was an intelligent, sensitive, and ambitious boy who grew up in a harsh environment. Georgian literature of that time was often marked by national consciousness, suffering, and resistance. In an empire that united many peoples under Tsarist rule, language and culture could become political. Anyone who grew up as a young Georgian felt that identity was not a matter of course. This also contributed to Soso's early exposure to questions of domination, oppression, and resistance. Despite his talent, his life remained overshadowed by uncertainty. The conflict between the parents became stronger and stronger. His father apparently wanted his son to become a shoemaker as well, while his mother urged him to pursue a clerical career. There was more than personal wishes behind this dispute. It was about the future, status, and control. For the father, the son may have meant work and the continuation of his own life. For the mother, it meant hope for salvation from poverty and shame. Soso stood between these forces. He did not experience family as a harmonious place, but as a battlefield. Later, he was often to view political relationships in a similar way, as a struggle for influence, loyalty, and submission. As he grew older, he was given the opportunity to attend the seminary in Tbilisi. For a boy from a poor background, this was a huge step. Tbilisi, today's Georgian capital Tbilisi, was much larger, more diverse, and more politically vibrant than Gori. Religion, trade, nationalities, social inequality, and revolutionary ideas met there. But before Soso went there was already a lot in him: the ambition of an up-and-comer, the toughness of a child from a violent home, the discipline of a religious student, and the mistrust of a boy who had learned early on that closeness can be dangerous. Stalin's childhood should not be misunderstood as a simple explanation for his later rule. Not every person who experiences poverty, violence, or humiliation becomes a dictator. History never arises from a single cause. But in Stalin's case, personal experiences were combined with the conditions of an epoch full of upheavals. The Russian Empire was a multi-ethnic state with deep social contrasts. The peasants suffered, workers were exploited, national minorities felt oppressed, and the Tsarist order often responded to criticism with censorship, police, and violence. In such a world, A young person could learn that politics was not just a debate, but a struggle. So the boy from Gori did not grow up in a quiet, open society, but in an order characterized by hierarchy, poverty, religion, violence, and imperial rule. He learned to adapt, to be silent, to observe, and to work his way up. These skills later became political weapons. Stalin was to become a master at assessing people, recognizing weaknesses, and using patience. He was not the most brilliant orator of his generation, not the most famous theoretician, and not the most charismatic revolutionary. But he had another gift. He could wait, build networks, and seek power where others overlooked it. At the end of this first chapter, therefore, there is no dictator, but a child on his way to a larger world. A boy with scars on his face, with an ambitious mother, a violent father, and a head full of contradictions. He took more from Gori than memories. He took toughness, pride, shame, discipline, and the desire never to be powerless again. No one knew that this boy would one day decide the life and death of millions. But the first traces of his later path were already visible. Not as fate, but as a possibility. And therein lies the uncanny thing about Stalin's beginning. He did not begin as an exceptional figure in world history, but as a vulnerable, ambitious boy from a poor family. History did not make a demon out of him. She gave him opportunities. What he made of it was to shape an entire century. Chapter 2, From Seminary to Revolutionary. When the young Iosif Dzugashvili came to Tbilisi, he entered a world that was bigger, louder, and more dangerous than anything he knew from Gori. Tbilisi was not only the most important city in Georgia, but also a political and cultural hub in the Caucasus. Georgians, Armenians, Russians, Jews, Persians, and many other groups lived side by side here. Traders, civil servants, clergy, workers, students, and political activists shaped the streetscape. Above all lay the order of the Russian Empire, but unrest fermented under the surface. National movements, social tensions, and revolutionary ideas found fertile ground here. For a gifted, ambitious boy from a humble background, this city was both an opportunity and a temptation. Stalin's mother had high hopes for him. She wanted her son to become a priest, a respected man who could escape the misery of the family. The Seminary of Tbilisi was considered a strict but important educational institution. Those who were accepted there gained access to knowledge, discipline, and social advancement. For Kiki, his mother, the seminar was the way to a better life. For the young Soso, as he was still called, it was initially a place of opportunity. He received books, lessons, languages, history, religion, and a spiritual world that went far beyond the narrow streets of Gori. But it was precisely this education that also opened doors to thoughts that his mother had never intended for him. The seminary was strict, almost barracks-like. The students lived under constant control. Prayers, lessons, sleep times, behavior, and reading were monitored. The leadership demanded obedience, piety, and submission. Independent thinking was only desired as long as it remained within the church's teaching. Banned books, political conversations, and doubts about authority could be punished. For many young men who were trained there, this atmosphere had an oppressive effect. Stalin also learned here not only theology, but also the logic of closed systems. He saw how an institution shaped people, how it exercised control, and how it treated deviant thoughts as danger. This experience alienated him more and more from the church, even though it also showed him tools that would later become important in politics: discipline, secrecy, ideological language, and the power of an organization over the individual. In Tbilisi, Stalin came across books that were actually forbidden in the seminary. He was particularly fascinated by the literature of the Russian revolutionaries, socialist writings, and Marxist ideas. The world from which he came was marked by poverty, violence, and social difference. Marxism seemed to offer a great explanation for these experiences. He claimed that history does not happen by chance, but is determined by class struggle. He explained why some people had property, power, and education, while others worked a lifetime and yet remained poor. For a young man like Stalin, who knew the severity of social inequality from his own experience. This doctrine was not just theory. She gave his personal anger a political language. But Stalin did not become a revolutionary from one day to the next. His transformation was a process. Initially, he was a gifted student with literary interests. He wrote poems, some of which were even published. This side seems almost foreign today when you think of the later dictator. But it shows that Stalin had a strong imagination and understood the effect of language. Poems, myths, religious texts, and revolutionary slogans have something in common. They can bind feelings and place people in a larger story. Stalin learned early on that words have power. Later, he was to use this power not as a poet, but as a political ruler. In the seminary, however, his rejection of ecclesiastical authority grew. The more he read, the more he perceived the religious order as narrow and hypocritical. The teachers demanded humility, but they ruled with severity. They preached morality, but the system was based on fear. For Stalin, this was a school of mistrust. He learned to hide his true thoughts, to appear obedient to the outside world and to go other ways inside. Forbidden reading had to be hidden, contacts had to be carefully maintained, conversations had to be conducted in encrypted form. This capacity for a double existence later became a hallmark of his political life. Stalin was able to camouflage himself, remain silent, and wait. He didn't always have to fight openly. It was often more effective to establish networks in the background. The revolutionary circles in Tbilisi were diverse. There were social democrats, nationalists, workers' groups, and intellectuals who opposed the Tsarist order. Industrial development had created new social conflicts. Factories, railways, and oil fields in the Caucasus attracted workers who lived in harsh conditions. Long working hours, low wages, a lack of rights, and the arbitrariness of entrepreneurs and authorities made them receptive to radical ideas. Revolutionary activists tried to organize this discontent. Leaflets, secret meetings, strikes, and political training became means of resistance. Stalin found here a task that suited his temperament better than the priesthood, not to preach in the name of the church, but to fight in the name of the revolution. He joined Marxist groups and began to be politically active. In the process, a trait became apparent early on that would later become decisive. Stalin was not a brilliant theoretician like some other revolutionaries. He was not a man who stood out for his philosophical originality. His strength lay in organization, toughness, and practical work. He could approach people, prepare meetings, use secret structures, and take risks. In the underground world, different skills counted than in academic debates. You had to be careful, resilient, discreet, and willing to sacrifice personal safety. Stalin adapted to this world. The seminary reacted increasingly suspiciously to him. His performances became more irregular, his political stance more conspicuous. He inwardly moved further and further away from the path his mother had dreamed of for him. Finally, he left the seminary in 1899, officially because of unpaid fees or lack of participation in examinations, but in fact his break with the church career had long been certain. For his mother, this was a bitter disappointment. She had hoped that her son would become a priest and thus a man of faith and respect. Instead, he became a revolutionary, a man of the underground who opposed the very order that had made education possible for him. This break was more than a personal decision. It marked the transition from Iosif Dzugashvili, the poor Georgian seminarian, to a political fighter. The young man, who had once studied religious texts, replaced faith in God with faith in the revolution. But even this new faith demanded sacrifice, obedience, and enemy images. Marxism, as Stalin took it up, was not only analysis for him, but also a mission to fight. The world seemed to him to be a battlefield between oppressors and oppressed, between the old order and the new future. Anyone who stood in the way could quickly become an opponent. This step must be understood in the context of the Russian Empire. Around 1900, the Tsarist Empire was a state full of contrasts. It had vast territories, a huge army, and an old tradition of rule, but at the same time it was deeply tense socially and politically. The peasants suffered from poverty, workers demanded better conditions, national minorities demanded recognition, and the political police fought opposition with surveillance, prison, and exile. The government wanted to limit reforms without seriously encroaching on the Tsar's power. It was precisely this mixture of modernization and oppression that generated radicalization. Those who thought peaceful change was impossible began to see violence as a necessary means. Stalin learned during this time that revolution was not romantic. It meant not only grand speeches and ideals, but also conspiratorial work, mistrust, betrayal, danger of arrest, and tough discipline. The Tsarist secret police were constantly present. Informers were able to penetrate groups. One wrong word could mean prison. This atmosphere reinforced Stalin's already existing mistrust. It taught him to judge people by loyalty and usefulness. Friendship and politics rarely remained separate in such circles. Anyone who wavered was dangerous. Those who spoke could betray others. If you wanted power, you had to understand the mechanisms of fear. There was a bitter irony in this. The seminary had not made Stalin a priest, but it had prepared him in a different way. It had taught him discipline, living in a hierarchical institution, thinking in dogmas, and the ability to adapt outwardly while rebelling internally. The revolutionary movement gave these capabilities a new direction. Religious obedience became party discipline. Spiritual mission became political mission. The fight against sin became the fight against class enemies. Stalin did not simply switch from belief to disbelief. He switched from one closed worldview to another. At the end of this chapter, there is a young man who has left his old future behind. He has not become a priest, an obedient servant of the church, a quiet climber in an orderly world. He has chosen the dangerous path of the revolutionary. He is not yet the leader, not the dictator, not the man who will later strike fear into the hearts of millions. But important elements of his later personality emerge: patience, toughness, seclusion, ambition, ideological conviction, and a growing willingness to regard man not as an individual, but as part of a political struggle. So, the talented boy from Gori, became Iosif Dzugashvili, the Marxist activist. The next step took him deeper underground, into strikes, secret meetings, arrests, exile, and violence. There he was to learn that power does not only come from ideas, but from organization, fear, and determination. The seminary had not broken him. It had sharpened him. And the revolution gave this sharpness a direction that was to have devastating consequences for Russia and the world. Chapter 3: Underground, Bank Robberies, and Exile. After Iosif Dzugashvili left the seminary, there was no easy way back for him. The path his mother had dreamed of for him was broken. The gifted student, who might one day become a priest, became a man of the political underground. In this world, it was no longer tests, prayers, and ecclesiastical discipline that counted, but camouflage, courage, secrecy, and the willingness to risk everything for an idea. The young Stalin, who at that time was still working under various aliases, immersed himself in a milieu that was characterized by hope and fear at the same time. Hope, because many revolutionaries believed that they could create a completely new society. Fear, because every step could be watched by the Tsarist police. The Russian Empire at the turn of the century was a state full of tensions. It was huge, cumbersome, and marked by deep social contrasts. While a small elite had land, administration, and political power, millions of peasants lived in poverty. In the cities, a workforce grew up that worked under harsh conditions in factories, workshops, railway depots, and oil facilities. Especially in the Caucasus, in Tbilisi and Baku, industrialization, national conflicts, and social hardship collided. It was precisely there that Stalin found a political field in which he could prove himself. He was not an orator of great elegance, not a theoretician of outstanding depth, but he was resilient, tenacious, and capable of taking on practical tasks. For a revolutionary movement that had to work in secret, such qualities were valuable. In the early years of his political activity, Stalin moved between worker circles, illegal assemblies, and the distribution of revolutionary writings. Leaflets had to be written, printed, hidden, and passed on. Strikes had to be prepared, contacts had to be maintained, and spies had to be identified. The work in the underground was arduous and dangerous. Sometimes it consisted of hours of discussions in cramped rooms, sometimes of nightly walks through dark streets, sometimes of constant worry that a comrade had already been recruited by the police. Stalin learned not to see political work romantically. Revolution was not just idealism, but organization. It needed money, safe housing, false names, secret meeting places, and people willing to carry out orders. During this time, he began to use various aliases. The most famous name, Stalin, later became more popular. At first, he was known as Koba, among other things. This name came from Georgian literature and referred to a rebellious, avenging figure who fought against oppression. The fact that Stalin identified with such a name says a lot about his self-image. He did not see himself as an ordinary party worker, but as a man of struggle, as someone who had to survive in a hostile world. Koba was not soft, not yielding, not forgiving. In this name there was already an idea of toughness, pride, and retribution. Later, Koba was to become Stalin, the man of steel. Both names show how much he shaped his political identity as a fighting identity. The social democratic movement in the Russian Empire was not unified at that time. Within the Russian Social Democrats, there were fierce disputes over strategy, organization, and leadership. The split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks became decisive for Stalin. The Mensheviks relied more on a broader party, on development steps, and on cooperation with other opposition forces. The Bolsheviks around Lenin, on the other hand, demanded a tightly organized, disciplined party of professional revolutionaries. Stalin felt more and more attracted to this Bolshevik line. It corresponded to his temperament. A party as a fighting organization, led by a determined minority that knows what to do, suited his experiences in the underground. Discussions could be useful, but in the end decisions had to be made and action had to be taken. The years in the Caucasus made Stalin a man of practice. He participated in the organization of strikes and in political work among workers. Baku, the center of the oil industry, was a place of social hardship. People of different origins worked there under often miserable conditions. The oil barons earned enormous sums of money, while many workers had little security, rights, or decent living conditions. Baku was therefore fertile ground for revolutionary agitators. Stalin understood that social hardship could be politically useful. He spoke not only of abstract theories, but of exploitation, wages, bread, working hours, and dignity. At the same time, he was prepared to exacerbate conflicts if it benefited the movement. But revolutionary work cost money. Newspapers, printing plants, travel, weapons, secret apartments, and support networks had to be financed. Since legal means were hardly available, parts of the Bolshevik movement resorted to so-called expropriations. This meant armed robberies, often on state cash transports or banks. From the point of view of the revolutionaries, it was not ordinary theft, but the appropriation of funds of the enemy state for the cause of the revolution. From the point of view of the authorities, it was terror and crime. Stalin moved in this environment, in which the line between political struggle and organized violence was becoming ever thinner. The most famous case was the attack in Tbilisi in 1907. During this action, a money transport was attacked on Erevaner Platz. Bombs exploded, shots were fired, people died, and a large sum of money was captured. The action was associated with Bolshevik networks, and Stalin is considered by many historians to be an important organizer or at least a closely integrated figure in the background. Even if individual details are still discussed today, the process clearly shows the world in which he moved. For him, politics has long since ceased to be just a matter of persuasion. Violence could be a tool. Sacrifices could be accepted if the goal seemed big enough. This logic would later return to an unimaginable extent. The Tsarist police were increasingly watching Stalin. He was arrested several times and sent into exile. In the Russian Empire, Siberia was not only a geographical space, but a political instrument. Those who were considered dangerous could be isolated far away from the centers of power. Exile meant cold, distance, poverty, boredom, and insecurity. But for many revolutionaries, it was also a kind of school. There, political prisoners met, exchanged ideas, discussed strategies, and waited for the next opportunity to escape. Stalin was exiled several times and escaped repeatedly. These escapes strengthened his reputation as a tenacious, determined underground man. The exile shaped him in a special way. She taught him patience and coldness, not only in the physical sense. Those who had to survive in remote places learned to control emotions, to look at relationships soberly, and to understand time as a political resource. Stalin was not a person who gave up easily. Setbacks did not necessarily make him more cautious, but tougher. The constant persecution by the police increased his suspicion. Anyone who lives for years in a world where spies, traitors, and interrogations are part of everyday life begins to see loyalty as something rare and fragile. Later, when Stalin himself was at the head of the state, this mistrust was to become a basic principle of his rule. He saw enemies everywhere because he had matured politically in a world where enemies could actually be anywhere. At the same time, its importance within the Bolshevik movement grew. He was not the best-known head. Men like Lenin, Trotsky, or Plekhanov were much more visible intellectually and journalistically. But Stalin fulfilled tasks that were vital for the party. He knew the work underground, knew how to deal with workers, had experience with illegal structures, and was willing to take risks. Lenin valued such men because they not only talked, but acted. Stalin was one of those revolutionaries who anchored a movement in reality. Without organizers, couriers, printers, fundraisers, and local leaders, the big theories would have been ineffective. The price of this development was an increasing hardening of his thinking. The longer Stalin lived underground, the more he became accustomed to the logic of struggle. The world appeared to him in camps, comrades and opponents, revolution and reaction, discipline and betrayal. Interstices became dangerous. Doubt could be seen as weakness, contradiction as a threat. This attitude was not only his personal peculiarity, it was fostered by the conditions of a legal political struggle. But with Stalin, it was associated with a character that was already prone to seclusion, pride, and toughness. What remained a temporary protective reaction for others became part of a permanent political personality for him. During these years, a morality of higher purpose also emerged. If the goal was the liberation of the working class and the overthrow of the Tsarist Empire, then harsh means might seem justified. A bank robbery, a forgery, a threat, perhaps even a death were then not seen as ordinary crimes, but as steps in a historical struggle. It is precisely this way of thinking that is dangerous, because it subordinates the individual human being to the supposedly great goal. Stalin learned early on to think in such categories. Later, when he decided on agriculture, industry, the army, and the party, this logic was to affect millions of people. Anything that stood in the way of the plan could be eliminated. What was considered an enemy lost its claim to pity. At the end of this chapter, there is a Stalin who is far removed from the poor student from Gori, and also far from the possible priest his mother had wished for. He is now a professional revolutionary, practiced in camouflage, organization, and violence. He knows prisons, exile, flight, and illegal party work. He has learned that power does not belong to the loudest, but often to those who patiently build structures, bind people, and take risks. He is not yet a ruler, nor does he decide on states and armies. But the subsoil has shaped it. There he learned the methods that would later determine his political life: control, secrecy, discipline, toughness, and the willingness to sacrifice people to a goal. Thus, Iosif Dzugashvili did not simply become one revolutionary among many. He became a man who was trained in the darkness of political illegality and there gained a decisive insight: he who has organization has power. Those who control money, information, and loyalties can become stronger than those who only give brilliant speeches. Stalin took this lesson with him into the years to come. And when the Russian Empire soon sank into war, crisis, and revolution, it was precisely this ability that was to open the way to the top. Chapter 4: Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and the Road to Power. As Iosif Dzugashvili worked his way deeper and deeper into the revolutionary movement, not only his own life changed, but also the political landscape of the Russian Empire. The old order was under growing pressure. The Tsarist Empire was large, but cumbersome. It ruled over many peoples, many languages, and many social worlds, but its political structures remained rigid. The Tsar ruled with a claim that seemed to come from another time. As factories sprawled, workers flocked to cities, and new political ideas circulated, autocracy clung to obedience, police, censorship, and subordination. It was precisely in this contradiction that the explosive material of the coming years lay. For Stalin, the encounter with Lenin's ideas became decisive. Lenin was not just another socialist thinker. He embodied a special type of revolutionary, uncompromising, strategic, disciplined, and convinced that a small, well-organized party could steer history. Lenin did not believe that the working class would seize power spontaneously and on its own. It must be led by professional revolutionaries who dedicate their entire lives to the cause. This idea found fertile ground with Stalin. It matched everything he had learned underground. For him, politics was not an open conversation between equal opinions, but a struggle for power, direction, and organization. If you wanted to win, you had to be tougher, more patient, and more united than your opponents. It was precisely this attitude that distinguished the Bolsheviks from other currents of social democracy. They did not want a broad, loose movement, but a disciplined party in which decision and obedience were closely linked. For many critics, this seemed authoritarian. For Lenin and his followers, it was necessary. The Tsarist Empire hardly allowed open opposition. Anyone who wanted to work politically under such conditions had to act secretly, protect themselves, and be prepared to make sacrifices. Stalin, who knew prison, exile, and illegal work, understood this logic. He was not a man of great public debate, but he was a man of apparatuses, of contacts, of practical implementation. This was precisely his value for the Bolshevik movement. The revolution of 1905 showed for the first time how vulnerable the Tsarist Empire had become. The lost war against Japan, economic hardship, social tensions, and political discontent erupted in strikes, protests, peasant unrest, and mutinies. A workers' council, a Soviet, was formed in St. Petersburg, which for many revolutionaries seemed like a glimpse into the future. For the first time, it seemed possible that the old order could actually begin to falter. But the revolution failed. The Tsar made concessions, promised a representation of the people, and at the same time allowed the repression to continue. Many revolutionaries were arrested, exiled, or forced into exile. For Stalin, this experience was instructive. It showed that spontaneous uprising alone was not enough. Without a firm leadership, without a clear power strategy, and without control over armed forces, an uprising could be put down. In the years after 1905, Stalin remained an active party worker. He wrote, organized, traveled, made contacts, and took on tasks that were rarely glamorous, but remained important for the party. Within the Bolshevik movement, he rose slowly. Lenin noted him as a reliable and tough functionary from the Caucasus. Stalin brought something with him that many exiled theorists lacked: experience inside the Reich, in direct contact with workers, local groups, police, and illegal structures. He knew how the party functioned outside the debate circles. That made him useful. In revolutionary movements, it is not always the most brilliant minds who gain influence, but often those who keep connections, gather information, and do tasks that others do not want to do. An important step was Stalin's work on the nationality question. The Russian Empire was not a unified nation-state, but a multi-ethnic empire. Georgians, Armenians, Poles, Latvians, Ukrainians, Finns, Jews, Tatars, and many other groups lived under Tsarist rule. National oppression, cultural tensions, and demands for self-determination played a major role. Stalin, himself a Georgian from a peripheral region of the Reich, was able to understand this topic from his own experience. In his work on Marxism and the national question, he opposed mere nationalism and subordinated national movements to the class struggle. This was important for Lenin, because the Bolsheviks had to show that they took the problems of the non-Russian peoples seriously without endangering the unity of the revolutionary movement. This work strengthened Stalin's position in the party. It did not make him a great theoretician, but a man who could work on important political questions in Lenin's sense. The First World War finally changed everything. When the major European powers went to war in 1914, Russia was also drawn into a catastrophe. Millions of soldiers were mobilized. The front devoured people, material, and trust. The Russian army suffered heavy defeats, supplies collapsed in many places, the economy was overwhelmed, and hunger grew in the cities. The war relentlessly exposed the weaknesses of the Tsarist Empire. The government seemed incompetent, the casualties were getting bigger and bigger, and loyalty to the Tsar was waning. For Lenin, the war was an imperialist war in which workers and peasants died for the interests of the rulers. The Bolsheviks opposed the war and hoped that the military crisis would turn into a revolutionary crisis. Stalin spent a large part of this time in exile. He was not the man who stood on the great stages of the revolution from the beginning, but it was precisely his absence from the exile debates and his experiences within the empire that shaped his self-image. He saw himself as a practical revolutionary, as someone who had not only spoken but suffered, organized, and persevered. When the February Revolution broke out in 1917, the Tsarist order collapsed surprisingly quickly. Worker strikes, demonstrations, soldiers' mutinies, and the loss of political authority forced Nicholas II to abdicate. Suddenly, the old regime had disappeared, but the question of power was open. After the February Revolution, a double power structure emerged. On the one hand, there was the provisional government, which emerged from liberal and moderate socialist forces and wanted to keep Russia in the war. On the other side were the Soviets, i.e. councils of workers and soldiers, who had enormous authority on the streets and in the barracks. This situation was unstable. The country wanted peace, bread, and land, but the new government could not meet these expectations. A historic opportunity opened up for the Bolsheviks. They had to present themselves as a party that had a clear answer to the crisis. Stalin returned to Petrograd after the February Revolution and worked on the party newspaper Pravda. Initially, he took a more cautious line towards the provisional government than Lenin, who returned from exile in April 1917 and forced the party onto a more radical course with his April theses. Lenin demanded no support for the provisional government, an end to the war, land for the peasants, and all power to the Soviets. At first, these demands seemed bold, almost unrealistic, even to many Bolsheviks. But they struck a chord with a society that was exhausted by the war and disappointed by the old elites. Stalin subordinated himself to Lenin's line. Here, too, a pattern emerged. He could be tactically cautious, but when it became clear where the power lay within the party, he adapted and worked reliably within the new framework. In the course of 1917, the situation became more radical. The provisional government lost confidence. The military offensive in the summer failed. Economic hardship worsened, and the Kornilov coup attempt in August raised fears of a right-wing military dictatorship. The Bolsheviks gained influence in the Soviets. Their slogans were simple but powerful: peace, land, bread, and power to the councils. Stalin was not one of the most visible leaders in this phase like Lenin or Trotsky, but he was part of the Bolshevik power apparatus. He worked in party committees, helped with organizational issues, and supported the course that eventually led to the armed uprising. The October Revolution was less a spontaneous popular storm than a deliberate seizure of power in a moment of state weakness. The Bolsheviks used their position in the armed revolutionary forces of Petrograd, occupied important points of the capital, and overthrew the provisional government. For Stalin, this was the decisive breakthrough of his political world. The party, which had been persecuted for years, grabbed power. What had previously been conspiracy, theory, and hope now became government. But this was not the beginning of peace. but a new struggle. The Bolsheviks had seized power, but they had to maintain it against opponents from within and without. Stalin's role in the revolution was not that of the great tribune. He was not the man to electrify the masses with speeches. Nor was he the military organizer of the insurrection like Trotsky. But he was a man who established himself within the party, who seemed reliable enough to receive important tasks, and who understood that once power was seized, control over institutions would become crucial. While others shone in dramatic moments, Stalin learned where lasting power really lay: in appointments, files, committees, channels of communication, and loyalties. This is precisely why the year 1917 was so important to him. It not only brought about the overthrow of the Tsar and the Bolshevik seizure of power, it also showed him that history can be accelerated in crises. A state that has seemed unshakable for centuries can disintegrate in a matter of months when war, hunger, and loss of trust come together. A small party can become big if it seems more determined than all the others. A radical idea can become state power if its opponents hesitate. Stalin internalized these lessons. Power didn't just fall from the sky. She had to be recognized, seized, and then ruthlessly secured. At the end of this chapter, Stalin is no longer just a Georgian underground fighter. He is now part of the victorious Bolshevik leadership. He still stands in the shadow of Lenin and Trotsky, and hardly anyone suspects that this rather inconspicuous functionary, of all people, would one day outstrip all rivals. But his path to power has begun. The revolution did not immediately give him the top, but it gave him the field on which his special abilities could be effective. In the open arena of charismatic speeches, he was inferior to others. However, he was to become dangerously strong within a party that increasingly controlled the state, police, army, and administration. The Bolsheviks had conquered Russia. Stalin now began to understand, penetrate, and one day dominate the Bolsheviks themselves. Chapter 5: The Civil War and the Birth of the Soviet State. The October Revolution had given power to the Bolsheviks, but it had not yet given them a state. Between the fall of the provisional government and the real control of the vast former Tsarist empire lay an abyss of war, hunger, chaos, betrayal, and violence. In 1917, Russia was not simply a country that only needed a new government. It was an exhausted empire whose army was crumbling, whose economy was collapsing, whose villages were clamoring for land, and whose cities were suffering from supply crises. The Bolsheviks were faced with a formidable task. They not only had to govern, but also enforce their rule in the first place. Revolutionaries who had worked underground for years suddenly became statesmen, commanders, heads of administration, and judges of life and death. In this brutal transitional period, Stalin was also further shaped. The Civil War turned Bolshevik power into a dictatorship, and Stalin learned how to rule in a world where pity could be seen as weakness and doubt as danger. The new Soviet state was born under conditions that could hardly have been more difficult. The First World War had not yet ended. Millions of soldiers were tired of war, the fronts were disintegrating, and the supply of the cities was getting worse and worse. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had promised peace, but the price was high. With the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, Russia withdrew from the war, but had to accept enormous territorial losses. For many opponents of the Bolsheviks, this treaty was a national betrayal. For Lenin, it was a bitter necessity, because he believed that the revolution could survive only if it first broke away from the imperialist war. This decision already showed the core of Bolshevik politics. It was not honor, tradition, or national feelings that determined the course, but the question of what benefited the party and the revolution. The Civil War arose from many conflicts at the same time. There were not simply two neatly separated camps. On one side were the Reds, i.e. the Bolsheviks and their supporters. On the other side were the so-called Whites, a disparate alliance of monarchists, liberal Republicans, conservative officers, disappointed socialists, and other opponents of the Bolsheviks. In addition, there were national movements in regions such as Ukraine, the Baltic states, the Caucasus and Central Asia, peasant uprisings, foreign intervention troops, and local rulers. Everyone fought for different reasons. Some wanted the Tsar back, some a parliamentary order, some national independence, some simply bread, land, and security. The Civil War was therefore not only a military struggle, but a struggle for the future of the entire area, which had once been ruled by the Tsar. For the Bolsheviks, it was a matter of survival from the very beginning. They controlled important centers such as Petrograd and Moscow, but large parts of the country eluded their power. Their opponents had experienced officers, support from abroad, and at times, large areas. At the same time, the Reds had a decisive advantage. They had a clearer political leadership and controlled the central area with important railway lines, industrial plants, and administrative structures. In a civil war, where supplies, transport, and organization were often more important than individual battles, this advantage could be decisive. The Bolsheviks understood that power was not based on slogans alone. They needed an army, a secret police, an administration, a system of compulsory procurement, and a party that could enforce orders. In this phase, Stalin emerged as a practical power politician. He was sent to various crisis fronts and took on tasks that involved supply, military organization, and political control. His role in Tsaritsyn, which later became Stalingrad, became particularly important. The city was strategically important on the Volga and was important for the supply of grain and for connections to the south. There Stalin showed how he understood power. He distrusted many former Tsarist officers who were deployed as military experts in the Red Army. Trotsky, who as People's Commissar for War built up the Red Army, considered these experts indispensable because the Bolsheviks alone did not have enough military experience. Stalin, on the other hand, saw in them possible traitors. This conflict was more than a personal rivalry. He showed two different approaches to power: Trotsky's attempt to use military professionalism under political control, and Stalin's tendency to value loyalty over expertise. In Tsaritsyn, Stalin proceeded with great severity. Suspects were arrested, officers were put under pressure, actual and alleged traitors were eliminated. The atmosphere was one of mistrust. Stalin preferred to rely on political allies such as Kliment Voroshilov and other men who would later belong to his entourage. It was here that networks emerged that became important for his later power. The Civil War was not only a struggle against external opponents, but also a space in which personal loyalties were forged. Those who experienced crises, violence, and responsibility together could form a lasting political alliance. For Stalin, such ties were valuable. He gathered around him men who were committed to him and whose rise remained closely linked to his own. The violence of the Civil War radicalized all sides. The whites committed massacres, carried out terror against Bolsheviks, Jews, workers, and peasants, whom they considered revolutionary, and were often deeply divided themselves. The Reds responded with the Red Terror, which was organized by the Chayka, the political secret police. This violence was not seen as an unfortunate exception, but as a necessary means of defending the revolution. Anyone who was considered a class enemy, saboteur, spy, or counter-revolutionary could be persecuted, imprisoned, or shot. The language of politics became the language of war. Opponents were no longer people with different convictions, but enemies of history. It was precisely in this attitude that one of the most dangerous developments of the new state lay. The state of emergency became a habit. The Civil War also gave rise to so-called war communism. The Bolsheviks confiscated grain, nationalized enterprises, controlled distribution and production, and tried to direct scarce resources centrally. In theory, it was about supplying the Red Army and the cities. In practice, the policy led to enormous suffering, resistance, and economic collapse. Farmers did not want to give up their grain if they received little in return. Workers left starving cities and went to the countryside. Black markets flourished. The state reacted with coercion. For Stalin, this was another school of power. He saw that a government that has a big goal can be willing to intervene deeply in people's lives. Property, food, work, and movement became political. The individual counted less than the needs of the state. During this time, the Red Army grew into a decisive instrument of Bolshevik rule. Trotsky played a prominent role in building this army. He traveled from front to front in his famous armored train, giving speeches, ordering measures, and combining revolutionary energy with strict discipline. Deserters were severely punished, units were checked, political commissars were appointed. Stalin watched this rise of Trotsky with growing unease. While Trotsky became famous as a brilliant organizer and orator in the Civil War, Stalin remained less visible, but by no means insignificant. His experience on the front lines and in crisis areas strengthened his conviction that political reliability was more important than any other skill. The conflict between Stalin and Trotsky, which would later shape the power struggle after Lenin's death, had an early basis here. The Bolsheviks did not win the Civil War because they were popular everywhere. They won because their opponents were fragmented, because the whites did not offer convincing land policies to many peasants, because foreign intervention could strengthen national resistance to the Bolsheviks' opponents, and because the Reds built a centralized leadership. Many peasants did not like the Bolsheviks, but feared a return of the old landlords even more. Many workers suffered under the new regime, but did not see a better future in the whites. The Bolsheviks offered a clear power structure in a time of disintegration. This was not enough to build a free society, but it was enough to win a civil war. For Stalin, the victory of the Reds was a confirmation. He was able to learn from this that toughness could be successful, that central control could defeat chaos, and that political opponents had to be eliminated rather than convinced. The Civil War gave the Bolshevik rule its character. A party that had spoken in the name of the workers and peasants became a party that ruled over workers and peasants. Revolutionary idealism became a system that asserted itself with police, army, censorship, and coercion. Of course, the Bolsheviks explained this by the emergency. They said that the revolution was surrounded by enemies, and that without harshness it would be destroyed. But the drugs introduced during the Civil War did not simply disappear. They became part of political thought. After the military victory, the country was left devastated. Industry and agriculture were on the ground. Cities were depopulated, hunger and disease were spreading, and millions of people had experienced violence, flight, and death. The Bolsheviks had won, but they ruled over an exhausted country. Precisely for this reason, the question of how the new state should be built became decisive. Should there be a return to more economic freedom to stabilize the country? Or should the party further tighten the coercion? In the early 1920s, Lenin decided to temporarily retreat tactically with a new economic policy. Farmers were allowed to sell more again, small farms were able to work more privately, and the state tried to calm the economy. But politically, power remained firmly in the hands of the party. Stalin's future lay in this new order. The Civil War had shown that open violence could secure power. The subsequent formation of the state showed that permanent rule needed administration. It was there that Stalin began to become increasingly important. While others stood out through speeches, theories, or military glory, he moved more and more in the structures of the party. He understood that the new state did not live on big decisions alone, but on appointments, responsibilities, files, reports, and loyalties. Those who controlled who got which job, who had access to information, and who were considered reliable could shape the future of the party. At the end of this chapter, there is the birth of a state that had emerged from war and revolution, and was therefore characterized by violence from the beginning. The Soviet state did not come into being in peace, not through broad democratic approval, but in the fire of a civil war. Its institutions were built while enemies threatened from all sides, while hunger prevailed, and while the party learned to treat the state of emergency as normal. Stalin was not yet the sole ruler in this process. But he learned the decisive lessons of his later dictatorship. Power must be organized. Loyalty is more important than trust. Violence can be politically useful, and whoever controls the apparatus ends up controlling more than any brilliant orator. The Civil War finally destroyed old Russia. At the same time, he created the ground for the state that Stalin would later shape in his own image. Chapter 6: General Secretary, the Inconspicuous Key to Dictatorship. After the Civil War, the young Soviet power was faced with a task that seemed less dramatic than revolution and frontline fighting, but became even more decisive in the long term. The new state had to be organized. The Bolsheviks had defeated their opponents, but they ruled over a devastated country, starving cities, exhausted villages, destroyed transport routes, and a society torn apart by years of war. The revolution had made great promises: peace, land, bread, power for the workers and peasants. But the reality consisted of scarcity, coercion, administration, and the question of who was actually allowed to decide in the name of the revolution. In this phase, Joseph Stalin began to take a path that at first hardly seemed spectacular. He did not become famous for great speeches, not for a brilliant theory, nor for a heroic myth at the front. He gained power by learning to control the apparatus of the party. In 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. At first glance, this office seemed technical and bureaucratic. It did not sound like the center of a future dictatorship, but like administration, files, meetings, and personnel issues. This was precisely where its importance lay. In a party that increasingly permeated the state, business, army, police, and social life, personnel decisions were power decisions. Who determined which functionary was appointed to which post, who had access to information, who was promoted and who was transferred, could shape the entire political landscape. Stalin recognized earlier than many others that the real power in the new Soviet order lay not only in the rostrums, but in the corridors of the party. The Bolsheviks had seen themselves as the vanguard, as the leading force of the revolution. But after the victory in the Civil War, this party became the core of the state. Its members occupied administrative positions, ran factories, controlled local authorities, monitored newspapers, influenced courts, and decided careers. The boundary between party and state became increasingly blurred. Those who rose in the party could determine people, resources, and institutions. Therefore, control of the party became control of the country. Stalin understood this development with a practical sobriety that his rivals underestimated. While others were still arguing about which line was theoretically more correct, Stalin created a network of dependencies. As General Secretary, he was able to prepare appointments, influence proposals, evaluate personnel files, and connect functionaries with each other. He knew weaknesses, ambitions, loyalties, and conflicts. In a revolutionary movement that had been shaped for years by personal contacts, secret work, and mistrust, such knowledge was invaluable. Stalin did not always have to be the center of attention. Often it was enough to put the right people in the right places. A party secretary in a province, a reliable man in a committee, a loyal functionary in a supervisory authority. All of this seemed inconspicuous individually, but together it became a fabric of power that became ever closer to the party. His strength was that he understood the needs of many middle and low officials. After civil war and revolution, many longed not for endless ideological debates, but for stability, advancement, and clear leadership. The party grew, and with it grew a new layer of people whose lives depended on party posts, housing, provisions, relationships, and political recognition. Stalin offered these people something that was very attractive to them: order, career opportunities, and protection as long as they remained loyal. He did not always speak in grand visions, but he was able to make a career possible. Those who were committed to him had good reasons to support him. This kind of power was quiet but effective. Men like Trotsky appeared more brilliant on the outside. Trotsky was a brilliant orator, an important figure of the revolution, and the organizer of the Red Army. Many observers would have expected him to be the natural successor after Lenin's death. But Trotsky was at once proud, often arrogant, and unpopular with many party officials. He had enemies, and he underestimated the power of the apparatus. Stalin, on the other hand, moved patiently through meetings, committees, and personnel issues. He seemed crude, sometimes inconspicuous, but he gathered influence exactly where the new order was administered. He did not build power through enthusiasm, but through dependence. Lenin himself realized towards the end of his life that Stalin had become dangerous. After several strokes, Lenin's health was severely weakened and he could no longer govern as before. During this phase, He watched with concern how Stalin used his position. In particular, Stalin's rudeness, his dealings with comrades, and his concentration of power worried Lenin. The conflict was also exacerbated by the question of nationality policy and Stalin's behavior towards Lenin's wife Nadezhda Krupskaya. Lenin thought about having Stalin removed from the office of General Secretary. But his illness prevented him from fighting this fight consistently. That was one of the decisive turns in Soviet history. The man who could have stopped Stalin lost the strength to do so. Stalin profited from this situation. He presented himself to the outside world as a loyal disciple of Lenin. He understood that Lenin's authority in the party was almost sacrosanct. Those who could present themselves as true keepers of Lenin's legacy gained enormous legitimacy. Stalin therefore worked to closely connect his own image with Lenin. He was not the great theoretician of the revolution, but he was able to present himself as a reliable executor of the Leninist line. This role was politically wise. It allowed him to portray opponents not only as personal rivals, but as people who allegedly deviated from the right path of the party. The General Secretary thus became the guardian of belonging and orthodoxy. In a party that increasingly saw itself as the sole bearer of truth, this was of enormous importance. Political differences were not treated simply as disagreements. They could be seen as deviations, faction formation, or a threat to the unity of the party. As early as 1921, the party had banned parliamentary groups. What began in the crisis of the Civil War as a measure to secure unity later became an instrument against inter-party opposition. Stalin was able to use this logic. Anyone who stood against his line could appear as a disturber of unity. Those who demanded unity indirectly strengthened the apparatus that Stalin controlled. At the same time, the Soviet Union was not yet the totalitarian state of the 1930s. There continued to be debates, conflicts, and different ideas within the party about the economy, world revolution, peasant policy, and the pace of socialist construction. But the rules of these debates shifted. It was no longer just the better argumentation that counted, but the ability to organize majorities in committees, influence delegates, and control party structures. Stalin became more and more adept at this. He at times allied himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky, and later with others against his former allies. His alliances were tactical. He didn't have to beat every opponent at once. It was enough to isolate them one by one. His office gave him the means to do so. He was able to promote people who supported his view and marginalize others. He was able to direct information, prepare discussions, and perceive moods in the apparatus. This was not open autocracy, but it was the construction of its prerequisites. Stalin created a political environment in which more and more careers depended on his approval. Those who wanted to move up were careful not to stand against him. Those who were unsure adapted. Thus, power was not created by a single coup d'état, but by many small shifts. It was precisely this slowness that made Stalin's rise so dangerous. Many of his rivals realized too late what was happening. They considered him a crude organizer, useful, but not superior. They saw his weaknesses, but not his strategic patience. They underestimated that in a party state the organizer could become more important than the speaker. Stalin did not have to win the hearts of the masses as long as he controlled the party that spoke in the name of the masses. He did not have to decide every dispute immediately, as long as he could determine who was allowed to vote in the end and whose career depended on which result. It was also during this period that Stalin's relationship to the bureaucracy was formed. Officially, the Bolsheviks condemned bureaucracy, privilege, and alienation from the workers. In reality, the new state needed an ever larger administration. Planning, reports, supply, control, party discipline, and economic control created files, offices, and hierarchies. Stalin turned this necessity into a weapon. He did not see the state as an obstacle to revolution, but as a tool. While some revolutionaries still dreamed of a future society without domination, Stalin built an order in which rule became ever denser. At the end of this chapter, Stalin does not yet stand as the undisputed dictator. Lenin is still alive, albeit seriously ill. Trotsky is still powerful. Other old Bolsheviks have prestige, networks, and political experience. But Stalin now possesses something that will be more decisive than fame in the long run: access to the apparatus. He knows the party from the inside, he controls paths of advancement, he gathers loyalties, and he understands how power takes root in everyday life. It was not the loudest moment of the revolution that opened the way to autocracy for him, but an office that many initially underestimated. The General Secretary was the administrator of the party. But in a state where the party was above all else, the administrator could become the master of the system. Stalin had found the key. All he had to do was turn it. Chapter 7: The Power Struggle After Lenin's Death. When Lenin died on January 21, 1924, the young Soviet Union lost not only its most important leader, but also the man whose authority had held the party together until then. Lenin was more than a politician for the Bolsheviks. He was the founder, the theoretician, the revolutionary who had led the party through persecution, war, coup, and civil war. As long as he lived, conflicts within the party leadership could be tamed by his influence. After his death, however, a question arose that no one openly voiced, but which nevertheless occupied everyone: who would take over Lenin's inheritance and determine the direction of the new state? At first glance, Stalin did not seem to be the most likely successor. Leon Trotsky was more famous, more educated, more brilliant, and better known internationally. He had played a central role in the Revolution of 1917 and organized the Red Army in the Civil War. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev also belonged to the old Bolshevik leadership and had close ties to Lenin. Nikolai Bukharin was considered an important theoretician of the party and was held in high esteem by Lenin for a time. Stalin, on the other hand, seemed to many to be coarse, cumbersome, and not very charismatic. He was not a speaker who inspired the masses. He was not a thinker who shone with great writings. But it was precisely this apparent secondariness that made him dangerous. While others saw themselves as natural leaders, Stalin patiently built the foundations of his power. Stalin's decisive advantage lay in the party apparatus. As General Secretary, he controlled personnel issues, transfers, appointments, and information. He knew who was ambitious, who was insecure, who was looking for a job, and who wanted to work their way up through loyalty. In a party that increasingly dominated the state, this meant enormous power. The struggle for Lenin's succession was therefore decided not only by speeches and programs, but by delegates, committees, votes, dependencies, and networks. Stalin understood better than his rivals that political power arises not only where great ideas are formulated, but where people can make or lose careers. Lenin's so-called will played an important role. In the last months of his life, Lenin had dictated several critical assessments by leading party officials. He also commented on Stalin. He criticized his rudeness and suggested that consideration be given to removing him from the office of General Secretary. For Stalin, this assessment could have been dangerous if it had been used openly and consistently against him. But that is exactly what did not happen. The party leadership treated the document cautiously and prevented it from having a broad political impact. Stalin's opponents also hesitated. Some feared that an open confrontation could endanger the unity of the party. Others believed that Stalin could be controlled or later slowed down. This miscalculation was to prove disastrous. Stalin did not act as an open usurper after Lenin's death. He presented himself as a loyal disciple of Lenin, as a preserver of unity, and as a man of stability. The emerging cult of Lenin was particularly important. After his death, Lenin was not simply buried and historically classified, but made an almost sacred figure of Soviet power. His body was embalmed and exhibited in the mausoleum in Moscow. His writings became the basis of political orthodoxy. Anyone who could refer to Lenin had moral and ideological authority. Stalin understood this symbolism and used it masterfully. He did not present himself as an independent opponent of other leaders, but as the one who protected Lenin's work. His first great opponent was Trotsky. Trotsky was respected, but also isolated. Many old Bolsheviks distrusted him because he had joined the Bolsheviks relatively late. He was also considered haughty and not very skilled in dealing with party officials. Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev initially formed an alliance against him. This alliance was not based on deep friendship, but on common interests. They wanted to prevent Trotsky from taking the lead. Stalin took advantage of the fear of division and factional struggle. Trotsky was increasingly portrayed as a danger to the unity of the party. His criticism of bureaucratization and his reference to the need for international revolution were turned against him. A central point of contention was the question of world revolution. Many Bolsheviks had originally believed that the Russian Revolution could only survive if socialist revolutions were also victorious in other countries, especially in Germany. After the failed revolutionary movements in Europe, this hope became weaker. Stalin formulated the line of socialism in one country. By this he meant that the Soviet Union could build socialism even without an immediate world revolution. This idea was politically extremely effective. It gave the exhausted party and the devastated country a new perspective. Instead of constantly waiting for revolutions abroad, one's own state should be strengthened. To many officials, this sounded more realistic and stable than Trotsky's emphasis on permanent revolution. Trotsky gradually lost influence. He was forced out of important positions, his supporters were transferred or marginalized, and his criticism was portrayed as harmful to the party. Stalin defeated him not by a single blow, but by systematic isolation. While Trotsky hesitated for a long time to fight openly and decisively, Stalin used the mechanics of the party. He controlled majorities, shaped debates, and made opponents appear as troublemakers. In 1925, Trotsky lost his post as People's Commissar for War. This broke his most important instrument of power. His fame remained, but fame alone was not enough against an apparatus that was already increasingly opposed to him. After Trotsky was weakened, Stalin turned against former allies. Zinoviev and Kamenev had believed that they could use Stalin as a counterweight to Trotsky. Now they realized too late that they themselves had strengthened the man who would disempower them. They temporarily joined forces with Trotsky to form the united opposition and criticize the growing bureaucratization and Stalin's course. But their credibility was damaged. They had previously helped to suppress opposition voices. Now that they themselves became oppositionists, they could hardly invoke freedom within the party without exposing their own past. Stalin took advantage of this weakness. He presented the opposition as disunited, ambitious, and dangerous for the party. The fight against Zinoviev and Kamenev showed Stalin's tactical talent particularly clearly. He was willing to change alliances without feeling morally bound. Against the left-wing opposition, he now allied himself more strongly with Bukharin and the right wing of the party, which wanted to hold on to the new economic policy. This policy allowed farmers and small traders limited economic freedoms and had led to some stabilization after the devastation of the Civil War. Bukharin relied on a slower path to socialism and did not want to provoke the peasants excessively. Stalin initially supported this line because it served him well in the power struggle. He was less concerned with firm economic conviction than with the question of which position weakened his opponents and strengthened his own power. By 1927, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev had been largely eliminated politically. Trotsky was expelled from the party and later exiled. Zinoviev and Kamenev had to humble themselves, recant, and ask for readmission. For Stalin, this was a decisive victory. He had defeated the best-known rivals of the early succession struggles without having to present himself as an open dictator. Everything was done in the name of party discipline, unity, and Leninism. This was precisely the particular danger of his method. He destroyed opponents not outside the system, but with the rules, concepts, and institutions of the system itself. But after the victory over the left-wing opposition, Bukharin remained as the next possible rival. Bukharin was popular, intelligent, and considered one of the most important theoreticians of the party. He had supported Stalin in the fight against Trotsky and apparently believed that he could work with him. But he, too, underestimated Stalin's will to power. At the end of the 1920s, economic problems intensified, especially in the supply of grain. Stalin began to question the new economic policy more and more. Suddenly, he adopted positions that seemed tougher than what the left-wing opposition had previously demanded. He turned against the wealthier peasants, the so-called kulaks, and prepared a radical break, forced collectivization and accelerated industrialization. Bukharin warned against this course. He feared that a war against the peasants would shake the country and endanger the revolution. But Stalin had meanwhile amassed enough power to isolate Bukharin as well. Again, he used the apparatus, the language of party loyalty and the accusation of deviation. Bukharin and his followers were portrayed as right-wing dissenters, people who supposedly slowed down socialist construction and served the interests of the wealthy peasants. The man who had just been Stalin's ally now became an obstacle himself. He also lost the power struggle. These years show a basic structure of Stalin's policy. He rarely fought all opponents at the same time. He formed alliances, used them, dissolved them, and then turned against the nearest rivals. His strength was not only in scrupulousness, but patience. He understood that power could be gradually concentrated in a party dictatorship. Each defeated opponent changed the balance of power. Every person transferred, every controlled vote, every ideological condemnation made it more difficult to stop him. In the end, his rivals did not stand against him together, but one after the other alone. The power struggle after Lenin's death was therefore not merely a personal drama of ambitious men. He decided the future of the Soviet Union. With Trotsky's defeat, the party lost a more internationalist and more militarily revolutionary alternative. With the defeat of Zinoviev and Kamenev, another part of the old collective leadership disappeared. With Bukharin's fall, the hope for a slower economic course ended. Stalin remained, not because he had been the strongest from the beginning, but because he had the best command of the mechanisms of power. At the end of the 1920s, Stalin was not yet in every respect the sovereign ruler of the later years of terror, but the decisive obstacles had been removed. The party had become accustomed to viewing opposition as a danger. The apparatus was interspersed with loyal functionaries. The reference to Lenin served Stalin as a shield. His opponents were expelled, humiliated, or politically broken. Now he could do something that went far beyond inter-party intrigues. He was able to reshape the entire Soviet Union according to his will. The boy from Gori, the seminarian from Tbilisi, the underground fighter Koba, and the General Secretary Stalin had merged into a single figure, a man who had learned that power must not only be conquered, but organized. After Lenin's death, he did not simply ascend a throne. He had built it piece by piece. And when his opponents realized what had happened, he was already sitting on it. Chapter 8: Industrialization by Force. When Stalin eliminated his main rivals at the end of the 1920s, he was faced with a task that for him decided the future of the Soviet Union. The country was huge, rich in raw materials and full of people, but economically still far behind the major industrial powers. In many regions, farmers lived under simple conditions, worked with traditional methods, and produced mainly for their own needs or for local markets. The cities grew, but the industrial base remained weak. Machinery, steel, coal, electricity, railways, factories, and modern armaments factories were not available to the extent that Stalin considered necessary. For him, this backwardness was not only an economic problem, but a mortal danger. The Soviet Union was surrounded by states that were hostile to the communist revolution. Stalin believed that sooner or later a weak country would be crushed. This fear gave rise to a huge program of accelerated industrialization. Stalin wanted to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial state in a few years. What Western countries had built up over generations was now to be enforced in the shortest possible time. His famous thought was that the Soviet Union had lagged behind by many decades and had to make up this gap in a very short time, otherwise it would be crushed. This idea shaped all politics. For Stalin, industrialization was not normal economic development, but a war against backwardness. Factories became sections of the front, workers became fighters, plans became orders, and production figures became political commitments. The first five-year plan, which began in 1928, was the visible expression of this new course. The state determined what was to be produced, how much had to be produced, and which industries had priority. Particularly important were heavy industry, coal, steel, mechanical engineering, energy, and armaments. Consumer goods, housing, and the immediate needs of the population receded into the background. It was not about making people's lives more pleasant quickly. The aim was to increase the industrial power of the state. New factories were built, old plants were expanded, huge construction projects began. Places that were previously hardly known became symbols of a new age. Magnitogorsk, for example, was supposed to embody the triumph of socialist industrial power as a steel city. Dams, power plants, and industrial complexes were not only built, but also celebrated with propaganda. The official language of that time was full of enthusiasm. Newspapers reported on heroic workers, records, difficulties overcome, and the birth of a new society. Socialist construction was presented as a moral adventure. Young people were sent to construction sites, engineers were supposed to conquer nature, workers were supposed to exceed standards. Those who worked hard were considered heroes of the future. Anyone who expressed doubts could quickly appear as a saboteur or enemy. In this atmosphere, economic planning became a form of political mobilization. The state demanded not only work, but faith. People should not simply produce, they should feel part of a historical mission. But behind the heroic facade lay a reality full of harshness. The specifications of the plans were often unrealistic. Companies reported false figures to feign success or avoid penalties. Machines were missing, skilled workers were scarce, materials arrived too late, transports worked poorly. Many workers were former farmers who had little experience with industrial work. They flocked to the cities because the changes in the countryside drove them out or because they were looking for work in the new factories. The cities were not prepared for this influx. Housing was scarce, barracks and overcrowded accommodation became commonplace. Food, clothing, and medical care often remain inadequate. For millions of people, the development of industry did not mean progress in the everyday sense, but deprivation, exhaustion, and insecurity. Stalin consciously accepted these costs. For him, it was the result that counted, not the individual suffering. This attitude corresponded to his basic political logic. The individual human being was subordinated to the great goal. When the state needed steel, people had to toil. When coal was needed, mines had to meet their specifications. When errors occurred, one looked not only for organizational causes, but for culprits. Accusations of sabotage became an important instrument. Technical problems, poor planning, or excessive demands could be interpreted as deliberate damage. This created fear, but also adaptation. Those who bore responsibility learned to protect themselves, to accuse subordinates, or to gloss over figures. This created a system in which truth could become dangerous if it interfered with the plan. A particularly dark element of this industrialization was the use of forced labor. During these years, the Gulag grew into an important part of the Soviet economy. Prisoners were used for canal construction, mines, logging, roads, and other heavy work. Many were political prisoners, others ordinary prisoners, still others people who had been brought into the camp system through the brutal campaigns against alleged enemies of socialism. Forced labor fit the logic of a state that treated people as a resource. Where there was a shortage of workers and conditions were too harsh, the state could use prisoners. The human price hardly mattered. Disease, hunger, cold, and death were accepted. At the same time, industrialization profoundly changed Soviet society. Millions of people left the villages and became part of a new working class. Women increasingly entered industrial work, education and technical training were expanded, illiteracy was combated, and the state promoted a new elite of engineers, planners, party officials, and factory managers. For some people, this time actually offered opportunities for advancement. A farmer's son could become a worker, technician, or functionary. A young woman was able to receive education and penetrate into areas that were previously closed. This was precisely one of the contradictions of Stalinism. It destroyed lives, generated fear and suffering, but at the same time created real social mobility and transformed an agrarian country into an industrial power. This ambivalence does not make the historical assessment any easier, but it does make it more accurate. Stalin's industrialization was not just a senseless act of violence. She had a goal, and she achieved impressive results in certain areas. The production of steel, coal, machinery, and electricity grew strongly. The Soviet Union became an industrial superpower in the 1930s. Without this development, their ability to withstand the German attack in World War II would have been considerably lower. But the crucial question is not only whether industrialization was necessary, but how it was carried out. Stalin chose a path based on coercion, fear, overwhelm, and contempt for humanity. He modernized the country not through freedom and broad participation, but through commandos and sacrifices. Propaganda made a myth out of this trial. Posters showed strong workers, glowing blast furnaces, electric future, and smiling youth. The Soviet Union presented itself as a country that was building the future, while the capitalist West was sinking into the Great Depression. In fact, the crisis of capitalism from 1929 onwards seemed to many communists as a confirmation of their convictions. While banks collapsed and unemployment rose in Western countries, Stalin was able to claim that the planned economy was superior to the chaos of the market. This message also had an international impact. Many observers abroad saw impressive construction projects and believed they were witnesses to a new model of modernity. What they often did not see, or did not want to see, were hunger, compulsion, camps, and fear. In the companies themselves, a culture of competition and political control emerged. Later, the Stakhanov movement became famous, named after a miner who allegedly achieved extraordinary outputs. Such records were used for propaganda purposes to drive workers to higher performance. Those who exceeded the norm were celebrated. Those who stayed behind came under pressure. Performance was politically charged. A good worker was not only industrious, but socialistically conscious. A bad worker could be considered lazy, backward, or suspicious. In this way, politics penetrated into the rhythm of work. Production became loyalty. For Stalin, industrialization strengthened his rule enormously. It gave him a great historical project with which he could legitimize his power. He appeared not only as a party leader, but as the builder of a new state. At the same time, the restructuring made society more dependent on the center. Companies, cities, utilities, housing, education, and careers were increasingly determined by state decisions. Anyone who wanted to live, work, move up, or travel was integrated into a network of permits, plans, and controls. The state did not shrink after the Civil War was over. It became bigger, deeper, and more commonplace. But the price was enormous. People lived under pressure, the economy suffered from waste and poor planning despite growth, and the political culture became even more brutal. Anyone who reported a problem risked being declared a problem themselves. Anyone who criticized could be considered an opponent. Anyone who did not meet the targets had to expect punishment. This created a system that could force success, but damaged the truth. Fear produced obedience, but also lies. And lies in a planned state could have catastrophic consequences, because decisions were based on false figures and embellished reports. At the end of this chapter is a Soviet Union that changed at breathtaking speed. A predominantly peasant country became a state of factories, blast furnaces, power plants, and planning authorities. Stalin had proven that he could not only eliminate rivals, but set an entire society in motion. But this movement was not a free departure, but a forced march. Millions of people were torn from their lives, subjugated, mobilized, or sacrificed. Industrialization made the Soviet Union stronger, but it also made the state harder and more inhumane. Stalin built steel mills, but at the same time he built a system in which man himself was treated like raw material. This was precisely the tragedy of this enormous upheaval. The Soviet Union gained industrial power, but it paid for it with freedom, truth, and countless destroyed lives. Chapter 9: Collectivization and Famine. While Stalin had the Soviet Union industrialized by force, his gaze was increasingly directed towards the village. For him, agriculture was not only an area of daily life, but the decisive key to financing the industrial awakening. The new factories needed machines, workers, and raw materials. The cities had to be fed. The state needed grain that it could sell or use to feed the growing workforce. But the peasant world of the Soviet Union was difficult to control. Millions of peasants lived scattered across vast land, working on small farms, thinking in families, village communities, and harvest cycles, not in 5-year plans and production orders. For Stalin, this world was an obstacle. It was too slow, too independent, and too little dependent on the state. So he decided to break it. Forced collectivization began in the late 1920s and became one of the most brutal upheavals in Soviet history. The aim was to transform the private individual farms into large collective farms, so-called collective farms and sovkhozes. Officially, this was supposed to modernize agriculture. Machines, tractors, community work, and state planning were supposed to bring higher yields and improve the lives of farmers. In the propaganda, this sounded like progress, equality, and a socialist future. But in reality, for many farmers, it meant the loss of their land, their animals, their supplies, their self-determination, and often their lives. Collectivization was not a voluntary association, but an attack by the state on traditional peasant society. The enemy Stalin needed for this was called kulak. Originally, the term referred to wealthier farmers who had more land, livestock, or labor than others. But under Stalin, the term was expanded politically. A kulak could be anyone who resisted, hid grain, owned a few more animals, expressed criticism, or was considered inconvenient by local officials. The campaign against the kulaks was presented as a class struggle in the countryside. The party claimed that it was liberating the poor peasants from the exploiters. In fact, the violence affected not only the wealthy, but also broad sections of the rural population. Entire families were expropriated, deported, or taken to camps. Houses were searched, supplies confiscated, cattle taken away, people publicly humiliated. The state declared people enemies to justify their resistance to its own policies. Many peasants saw collectivization as a catastrophe. For them, land was not simply a production area, but a livelihood, heritage, security, and dignity. Cattle were not only possessions, but survival. If you had a cow, a horse, or a few sheep, you could feed your family, work the soil, and survive bad times. When the state demanded that this property be transferred to collective enterprises, many reacted with desperation and defiance. Some preferred to slaughter their cattle themselves rather than leave them to the collective. Others hid grain, refused to work, or fled. In some regions, there were open riots. But the state reacted with violence. Party officials, activists, police, and security organs were sent to the countryside to enforce the will of the leadership. Stalin saw this resistance not as an expression of real fear or despair, but as evidence of enemy sabotage. In its logic, there could only be resistance to socialist construction from class enemies. Anyone who opposed collectivization was therefore not simply a peasant defending his way of life, but an opponent of the revolution. This way of thinking made compassion impossible. It allowed entire groups to be disenfranchised and violence to be portrayed as a necessary purification. The village became the battlefield of a political war. The focus was not on tanks and armies, but on granaries, stables, village meetings, lists, confiscations, and deportation trains. The consequences were devastating. Agriculture was not modernized in an orderly manner, but plunged into a deep crisis. Experienced farmers were deported or intimidated. Livestock collapsed because animals were slaughtered en masse or were poorly cared for. Work in the new collective farms was often chaotic. Many people no longer had an incentive to manage carefully when the income and decision-making power belonged to the state. Local officials were under pressure to meet ever-increasing taxes and reported to the top what the leadership wanted to hear. The result was a dangerous mixture of fear, false figures, exaggerated expectations, and brutal coercive policies. The procurement of grain became more important than the survival of the people who had grown the grain. The situation became particularly dramatic in the early 1930s. Severe famines occurred in several regions of the Soviet Union, especially in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, the North Caucasus, the Volga, and other agricultural areas. Ukraine was of particular importance because it was considered one of the most important breadbaskets of the Soviet Union. There, grain taxes, repression, political control, and national tensions collided. The state enforced levy quotas, although the harvests were not sufficient in many places. Villages that did not meet their requirements were punished. Food was confiscated, freedom of movement restricted, cries for help ignored or suppressed. People were starving in a country that continued to squeeze grain out of the villages. The famine in Ukraine, often called the Holodomor, is one of the most harrowing chapters of this time. Millions of people died of hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Families broke up, villages were depopulated, children lost their parents, parents saw their children die. Hunger destroyed not only bodies, but also social bonds. People sold the last items, searched for food in fields, cooked grass, bark, or waste. In such extreme situations, moral boundaries are torn apart because the survival instinct suppresses everything else. The state, however, did not speak openly about the extent of the disaster. Instead of providing aid, he treated many starving people as suspects, as thieves of socialist property or as victims of their alleged backwardness. In Kazakhstan, the disaster took a different, but equally cruel form. There, collectivization met nomadic and semi-nomadic ways of life. The forcible settling of Kazakhs, confiscation of livestock, and state intervention destroyed the traditional way of doing business of many Kazakhs. The loss of the herds meant the loss of existence. There too, many people died. Others fled to neighboring regions or across borders. This tragedy shows that Stalin's policies did not only affect the Russian or Ukrainian peasants, but also forcibly forced the diversity of Soviet society as a whole under a central order. Different ways of life should not be understood, but adapted. Collectivization was therefore not only an economic measure, but an act of power. Stalin wanted to smash the peasantry as an independent social force. As long as farmers had land, supplies, and local structures, they could set limits on the state. After collectivization, the village was much more dependent on the state. Machine stations, party organizations, delivery systems, local cadres, and security organs intervened in the lives of the peasants. Those who wanted to eat, work, and survive were integrated into a system that was controlled from above. The peasants did not become free socialist producers, but subjects of a state that demanded their work and crops. At the same time, the squeeze of the village financed the industrial development. Grain could be sold or used to feed the cities. Workers streamed from the countryside to the industrial centers. The violence in the village and the construction of the factories were thus connected. The steel of the new plants, the machinery of the new factories, and the enormous construction projects of the 5-year plans were directly related to the suffering of the peasants. Industrialization had a rural dark side. What appeared in propaganda as a triumph of socialism was based to a considerable extent on confiscation, hunger, and coercion. Stalin's personal responsibility is central to this. He was not just a passive observer of a misguided policy. He pushed for toughness, mistrusted the peasants, interpreted resistance as class struggle, and did not allow the repression to stop when the catastrophe became visible. Although local functionaries, party careerists, and security organs also participated in the violence, they acted in a system whose direction came from above. The logic was clear. The plan had to be fulfilled. The party could not show any weakness. The village had to submit. When people died, This was not seen as a reason to fundamentally change course, but often as a result of alleged sabotage, backwardness, or hostile activity. These policies also changed the relationship between the state and truth. The famine could not be openly named, because it would have destroyed the myth of successful socialist construction. Anyone who talked about hunger could be in danger themselves. Journalists, officials, and foreign observers were controlled, information filtered, statistics manipulated or kept secret. The state created a reality in which the plan was successful, while people were dying in the villages. This split between official truth and lived reality became a basic feature of the Stalin era. Millions knew what was happening, but it was not allowed to be said publicly with such clarity. Collectivization left deep wounds. It destroyed peasant independence, damaged trust, turned villages into spaces of fear, and made violence a normal means of state policy. Soviet agriculture also remained plagued by problems in the long term. The promised efficiency did not materialize to the extent that the propaganda claimed. Coercion could drive people into collective farms, but it could not automatically replace motivation, knowledge, and responsibility. Many farmers worked only as much as they had to, directing their energy to small private plots when they were allowed. The state had subjugated the village, but not really made it the flourishing engine of socialism. For Stalin, however, the decisive point had been reached. The peasantry as an independent force was broken. After the victory over his rivals in the party, he had now also crushed the resistance in the countryside. The Soviet Union finally became a state in which political goals were set from above and enforced with ruthless force. Anyone who resisted was declared an enemy. Those who suffered were made invisible. Those who died disappeared into numbers that were long concealed. At the end of this chapter is one of the most bitter truths about Stalin's rule. The modernization of the Soviet Union was not only a reconstruction, but also a destruction. It produced factories, cities, and industrial strength, but at the same time it destroyed living environments, families, and millions of lives. Collectivization showed how far Stalin was willing to go if a goal corresponded to his power and view of history. For him, the village was not a place of human fates, but a space that had to be conquered, ordered, and squeezed out. The famine was not a natural disaster in the usual sense. It arose from political decisions, from coercion, confiscation, ideological blindness, and the willingness to sacrifice people to the plan. This made clear what Stalinism meant at its core. The state did not only demand obedience. He claimed life itself. Chapter 10: The Great Terror. After violent industrialization and forced collectivization, Stalin had already profoundly changed the Soviet Union. The peasantry was broken, the party was subjugated, the economy was under central command, and millions of people lived in a state that intervened more and more in every area of life. But Stalin was not satisfied with this. The greater his power became, the stronger his mistrust grew. He saw enemies not only outside the Soviet Union, but also within the party, the army, the administration, the factories, the villages, and even in his own environment. This mistrust gave rise to a wave of violence in the 1930s, which went down in history as the Great Terror. It was a time when fear became a basic political state, and no one could be sure that they would not suddenly be considered traitors themselves. Terror had many roots. One of them lay in Stalin's personal logic of rule. He had defeated his rivals, but that was precisely why he feared that others might one day become dangerous to him. Old Bolsheviks remembered times when Stalin had been only one of several leaders. They knew Lenin's criticism of him, they knew the inter-party struggles, they knew that his power had not been self-evident from the beginning. For Stalin, such people were dangerous, even if they had long since submitted. Their mere existence was a reminder that there had been other ways. Anyone who had a past that did not depend entirely on Stalin could become suspicious. A decisive trigger was the assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934, who was a high-ranking party official in Leningrad and was considered popular. His assassination was used by Stalin to launch a far-reaching campaign of repression. To this day, it is debated how much Stalin knew about the background or whether he even facilitated the murder. What is certain, however, is that he exploited the event politically. The murder was presented as evidence of an alleged conspiracy against the party. From now on, almost every opposition, every criticism, and every previous connection to Stalin's opponents could be interpreted as part of a hostile network. A single assassination attempt became a pretext for a comprehensive purge. The term purge sounds almost bureaucratic, but behind it was a human catastrophe. People were arrested, interrogated, beaten, threatened, and forced to confess. Many admitted things under torture that they had never done. Others burdened friends, colleagues, or family members to save their own loved ones or end the suffering. The secret police, then organized under various names and eventually known as the NKVD, became the instrument of this violence. Her employees worked with quotas, lists, and orders. Suspicion was enough. A previous acquaintance, a wrong word, a foreign origin, a professional mistake, or a denunciation could be enough to get caught up in the machinery of terror. The large Moscow show trials were particularly visible. In them, prominent old Bolsheviks were on trial, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and other men who had once belonged to the leadership of the revolution. The trials were not independent trials, but political stagings. The defendants confessed to absurd conspiracies, alleged collaboration with foreign powers, sabotage and assassination plans against Stalin and the Soviet leadership. Many of these confessions were forced by pressure, threats, and psychological attrition. For the public, however, they were supposed to prove that Stalin had been surrounded by traitors and could only save the revolution through vigilance. The trials created a cruel logic. If even famous revolutionaries could be traitors, then anyone could be a traitor. However, the terror did not only affect the political elite. He penetrated deep into society. Party officials, engineers, teachers, officers, writers, workers, farmers, scientists, members of national minorities, and simple neighbors could be arrested. Denunciations became a dangerous weapon. Some people reported others out of conviction, others out of fear, out of envy, out of career aspirations, or to protect themselves. In a climate where silence could be suspect, mistrust became commonplace. Families spoke cautiously, children heard things they could repeat at school, colleagues watched each other, and friendships became uncertain. The terror destroyed not only human lives, but also trust. A particularly devastating consequence was the purge of the Red Army. High-ranking officers, including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, were accused of conspiring against the state. Many experienced commanders were shot or sent to camps. Stalin wanted to ensure that the army remained politically loyal and did not form an independent power. But these purges severely weakened the military leadership. Just a few years before the German attack on the Soviet Union, the army lost many capable men. The fear of independent thinking and of making the wrong decisions was also paralyzing. Officers learned that political survival was sometimes more important than military truth. The terror was both centrally controlled and locally intensified. Stalin and the leadership set the direction, signed lists, approved arrests, and demanded toughness. But in the regions, some functionaries outdid each other out of fear or ambition. Anyone who did not act harshly enough could be suspected himself. This created a dynamic in which violence continued to escalate. Local authorities reported alleged enemies, the center confirmed measures, and the next wave began. Terror became a competition of loyalty. Those who unmasked many enemies showed vigilance. Anyone who had doubts risked being seen as negligent or complicit. For Stalin, the Great Terror fulfilled several functions. He eliminated old rivals, intimidated the party, renewed the leadership of younger cadres who owed their rise to Stalin, and forced society into a state of permanent dependence. After the purges, there were hardly any people in important positions who had authority independent of Stalin. The new elite knew that their lives and careers depended on his favor. Many were young, ambitious, and grateful for opportunities created by the arrest of others. So terror not only destroyed, it also created a new order of loyalty. But this order was based on lies. The alleged conspiracies were invented in their claimed form. The confessions were forced. The enemy images were inflated to justify political violence. At the same time, the Soviet public was forced into a world in which it had to repeat these lies. Newspapers celebrated the exposure of enemies of the people. Assemblies demanded harsh punishments. Workers' collectives convicted people whose cases they did not know. Those who did not participate became suspects. As a result, lying became a social ritual. You had to say what the state wanted to hear, even if you doubted inside. The human side of terror can hardly be overestimated. People disappeared from their homes at night. Relatives waited outside prisons for news. Children became children of enemies of the people and lost opportunities for education or work. Spouses were pressured to distance themselves from those arrested. Letters no longer arrived. Names were no longer allowed to be mentioned. Many families did not learn what had happened to their relatives until decades later. The terror not only grabbed the bodies of the victims, but also their memories. Those who were wiped out were also to disappear from photos, books, files, and conversations. At the same time, the country continued to live. Factories produced, schools taught, parades took place, songs were sung, films were made, successes were announced. It is precisely this simultaneity that makes the Stalin era so oppressive. While a family was mourning the loss of a father in one house, a poster of happy socialist life could hang on the street. While people disappeared into camps, propaganda celebrated the construction of a better future. The state demanded enthusiasm in a time of fear. Many people adapted because they had to survive. Others actually believed that enemies existed and toughness was necessary. Still others knew enough to remain silent. The Great Terror reached its peak in 1937 and 1938. During these years, hundreds of thousands were shot and many more were deported to camps. The violence was so widespread that it even endangered the functioning of the state. In the end, it was slowed down, not out of humanity, but because the leadership had to regain control of the destructive dynamics. Some of the NKVD leaders were later arrested and shot themselves, as if they had arbitrarily exaggerated the violence. But the responsibility reached to the center of power. Stalin had created, fueled, and used the system. At the end of this chapter, there is a Soviet Union that seemed stronger and more modern on the outside, but was inwardly riddled with fear. The Great Terror had shown that no one was permanently safe under Stalin. Not old revolutionaries, not peasants, not workers, not generals, not party functionaries, and not even the perpetrators themselves. Rule was based not only on consent or ideology, but on the constant possibility of sudden annihilation. Stalin had not simply secured his power. He had taught an entire country that survival could depend on remaining silent in time, adapting and lowering one's gaze. The Great Terror was therefore more than a series of political crimes. It was a system of rule. It destroyed possible alternatives, turned loyalty into fear, and made the state the judge of truth, guilt, and life. After this time, Stalin was no longer just the strongest man in the party. He was the center of a system in which his words meant fate. The revolution that had once promised liberation had turned into an order in which millions of people trembled before their own government. Chapter 11: The Gulag, Work, Punishment, and Extermination. The Gulag was not simply a network of prisons. It was its own empire within the Soviet Union, a huge system of camps, forced labor, transport, guarding, hunger, cold, and fear. Its name came from the abbreviation for the main administration of the camps, but in historical memory, Gulag stands for much more than an authority. He stands for a world in which people were torn out of their previous lives, turned into numbers, and sent to remote regions to work under inhumane conditions. The Gulag was punishment, intimidation, economic tool, and political warning signal at the same time. Anyone who lived in the Soviet Union had to know that the state could not only arrest and shoot. It could also make people slowly disappear, far away from their families, in snow, forests, mines, and barracks. The roots of this camp system lay in the early Soviet period. After the Revolution and Civil War, the Bolsheviks imprisoned political opponents, isolated them and forced them to work. But under Stalin, this system grew in a new dimension. Camps for enemies and prisoners became a huge part of Stalinist rule. Especially since the forced collectivization, the hunt for alleged kulaks, the purges and the Great Terror, the camps were filled with hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people. Some had actually been convicted of ordinary crimes, but many were political prisoners or people who had gotten into the system through absurd accusations, denunciations, or quotas. A wrong sentence, a late delivery, an alleged sabotage, a previous connection to an arrested person or belonging to a suspected group could be enough to be abducted into this world. The Gulag functioned according to a double logic. On the one hand, he was supposed to render opponents harmless. People who Stalin or the state considered dangerous were removed from society. They lost their jobs, their homes, their families, their names, and often any way to defend themselves. On the other hand, their labor power should be used. The Soviet Union was in the midst of a huge process of industrialization, and many projects were located in regions where free workers hardly wanted to live voluntarily. The North Siberia, the Far East, the forests, mines and construction sites demanded enormous physical work under extreme conditions. Forced labor seemed to offer the regime a solution. The state could send people where it needed them, regardless of wages, freedom, or survival. The camps were often located in areas that were cruel by their very nature. Cold, snow, swamps, forests, bad roads, and long distances made life difficult. The transport itself could already be fatal. Prisoners were abducted in overcrowded wagons over thousands of kilometers. They had little food, hardly any hygiene, and often no clear idea of where they were taken. For many, the real horror did not begin in the camp, but already on the way there. Families stayed behind, not knowing if they would ever see their loved ones again. A person could still be part of a family in the morning, and a few days later only a prisoner on a train heading north. In the camps, work determined everyday life. Prisoners had to cut wood, build canals, extract or mine gold, build roads, lay railways, cut peat, or work in factories. The working day was long, the tools often poor, the clothing inadequate, and the food scarce. The connection between food rations and work performance was particularly cruel. Those who met their norm got more to eat. Those who became weak and did less received less food and thus became even weaker. This created a deadly cycle. Hunger led to exhaustion, exhaustion to lower performance to smaller rations to illness and death. In such a system, the body was slowly consumed. The Gulag was not the same everywhere. There were camps with different tasks, climatic conditions, and mortality rates. Some prisoners survived for years, found niches, worked in relatively less lethal areas, or benefited from certain skills. Doctors, engineers, clerks, or skilled workers could sometimes have better chances than simple workers in mines or logging. But these differences did not change the core of the system. The prisoner had no rights. His life depended on orders, norms, guards, camp management, illnesses, and coincidences. Even those who survived were damaged internally. The Gulag not only deprived people of their freedom, but often also of trust in others, in language, in law, and in the idea that suffering must have some meaning. Regions such as Kolyma in the far northeast were particularly notorious. Gold and other raw materials were mined there under extreme conditions. The cold was murderous, the distances enormous, the supply difficult. For many prisoners, Kolyma became a symbol of extreme horror. Those who came there knew that the return was uncertain. But other projects also showed the brutality of the system. The construction of the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal was propagandistically celebrated as a great success, although it was built under enormous coercion, high mortality, and questionable economic benefits. In the official account, prisoners became people who were supposedly re-educated through work. In reality, they were exploited and often destroyed. The idea of re-education was an important part of Soviet justification. The state claimed that work reshapes people. Those who have violated the socialist order can be brought back into society through productive work. This language sounded pedagogical, almost moral. But in the Gulag, it usually meant coercion and dehumanization. The human being was not seen as a personality, but as a material that could be worked, broken, and used. Anyone who died was considered a loss of a workforce, not a tragedy of a life. This attitude fit in with the larger logic of Stalinism. The individual counted only to the extent that he benefited the plan, the state, and the party. The Gulag was also an instrument of fear outside the camps. Its existence had an impact on society as a whole. Everyone knew stories of people who had disappeared. A neighbor, a colleague, a teacher, an officer, a relative. Sometimes letters came from afar, sometimes not. Sometimes a prison sentence was mentioned, sometimes everything remained unclear. This ignorance was part of the horror. The Gulag didn't have to be visible all the time to be effective. It was precisely his invisibility that made him powerful. He was at the edge of the map and at the same time at the center of consciousness. People knew, anyone who stands out, who speaks wrongly, who has wrong relationships, who is unlucky, can end up there. The relatives of the prisoners were also hit. Women of so-called enemies of the people could be arrested themselves or excluded from society. Children were stigmatized, lost educational opportunities, or were taken to homes. Families had to decide whether to believe in the innocence of their loved ones or publicly distance themselves from them in order to survive themselves. So the terror of the Gulag did not end at the camp gate. It reached back into homes, schools, businesses, and neighborhoods. He turned private love into a political risk. Anyone who stood by an arrested person could become a suspect himself. In the camp itself, a separate social order emerged. There were political prisoners, ordinary criminals, more privileged prisoners, camp officials, spies, and guards. Relations between these groups were often marked by violence and mistrust. Criminal prisoners could be played off against political prisoners by the camp administration. Some prisoners tried to obtain better conditions by cooperating with the camp administration. Others stuck to small gestures of solidarity, a piece of bread, a piece of advice, a blanket, a shared word. In a world that was supposed to degrade people, such gestures could be the difference between life and death. But they were dangerous, because the system often rewarded conformity and betrayal more than humanity. Stalin himself regarded the Gulag as part of his apparatus of rule. It was not an unfortunate side effect, but a consequence of his policies. The mass arrests of the Great Terror, the deportations of collectivization, the hunt for alleged saboteurs, and the constant search for internal enemies provided the camp system with ever new people. The Gulag was the spatial extension of the suspicion. Anyone who was declared an enemy in the political center ended up on the edge of the Reich as a worker. In this way, ideology was combined with economics. The language spoke of enemies of the people and re-education. Practice demanded wood, gold, coal, canals, and roads. But economically, the Gulag was by no means always as efficient as its proponents claimed. Forced labor could mobilize massive crowds, but it was often disorganized, wasteful, and brutally ineffective. Sick, starving, and frightened people do not automatically work well. High mortality, poor planning, corruption, lack of materials, and extreme conditions reduce the usefulness of many projects. Nevertheless, the system stuck to it because it was not just about the economy. It was about control. The Gulag showed that the state could dispose of bodies. He could send people wherever he wanted and force them to work, even if that work destroyed their lives. The moral significance of the Gulag lies precisely in this connection between everyday life and annihilation. There was not always a moment of death sentence. Many people died slowly, from hunger, cold, disease, exhaustion, and hopelessness. Others survived, but came back as broken people. Still others were released after years, and yet remained marked, monitored, and viewed with social suspicion. The Gulag was not only a place of dying, but also a place of long degradation. He took away people's time, family, health, and dignity. Sometimes it even took away their ability to find their way back to a normal life after their return. In the official Soviet public, this world remained largely hidden or glossed over. Propaganda could portray camps as places of productive work, as proof that even former enemies would be included in socialist construction. The true experience of the prisoners did not fit the image of the happy workers' state. That is why there was silence, lying, and concealment. The camps existed in documents, orders, and transport lists, but not in the system's official moral self-description. This was a typical feature of the Stalin era. A huge reality was created and at the same time made linguistically invisible. The Gulag also had a profound impact on the culture of the Soviet Union. He created a society in which people learned to speak carefully, to hide memories, and to fear files more than rumors. He showed that law did not mean protection, but could be a tool of power. A verdict did not have to establish truth, but could confirm a political decision. Guilt was not necessarily proven, but assigned. This experience destroyed confidence in the idea of a just state. Anyone who knew the camps knew that a person could become completely deprived of rights as soon as the state marked him as an enemy. At the end of this chapter, the Gulag stands as one of the darkest symbols of Stalinist rule. It was not only a penal system, but a mirror of the entire regime. Fear, ideology, coercion, economic ambition, and contempt for humanity were condensed in it. The Gulag showed what happened when a state completely subordinated the individual to the political goal. People were abducted, counted, guarded, driven to work, and often forgotten. Their ailments disappeared behind production plans and safety reports. But it is precisely these forgotten voices that belong at the center of the story. Stalin not only built factories, armies, and party apparatuses. He also built a world in which millions of people had to learn that their lives could be claimed by the state at any time. The Gulag was the place where this truth became most brutally visible. There, the language of progress, socialism, and the future ended in barracks, barbed wire, frost, and hunger. And there it became clear that a rule that sees man only as a means not only destroys its enemies in the end, but attacks humanity itself. Chapter 12: Stalin and Hitler, Pact, Deception, and War. As the 1930s drew to a close, Europe was on the brink of a new catastrophe. The First World War was little more than 2 decades ago, but its consequences were felt everywhere. Borders had been shifted, empires had collapsed, new states had emerged, old humiliations had remained. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had taken power and turned the Weimar Republic into a National Socialist dictatorship. His policy was based on rearmament, expansion, racial ideology, and the goal of conquering new living space in the East. For the Soviet Union, this development was threatening from the beginning. Hitler's worldview was openly anti-communist, anti-Semitic, and oriented towards a future war against Bolshevism. Nevertheless, an agreement was reached in 1939 that shocked the world. Stalin and Hitler, two ideological mortal enemies, concluded a non-aggression pact. To understand this step, one must look at the situation from Stalin's point of view. The Soviet Union felt surrounded by hostile powers. Japan threatened Soviet interests in the Far East. Germany was rearming in Europe. Poland and Romania were suspicious of the Soviet Union, and the Western democracies of Great Britain and France seemed unreliable to Stalin. The Munich Agreement of 1938 in particular increased his mistrust. At that time, Britain and France had given in to Hitler's demands on Czechoslovakia without seriously involving the Soviet Union. Stalin was able to draw the conclusion that the Western powers perhaps wanted to steer Hitler eastwards. Whether this fear was fully justified in this form or not played less of a political role than the fact that Stalin considered it plausible. Stalin was not a man who viewed international politics morally. For him, what counted was power, time savings, and security of his own system. He knew that the Red Army had been severely weakened by the purges. Many experienced officers had been shot, arrested, or intimidated. Industrialization had strengthened the military base of the Soviet Union, but the army was in a difficult state. Stalin needed time to rearm, produce new weapons, and organize defense. A direct war with Germany in 1939 seemed risky. If the capitalist powers exhausted themselves among themselves, the Soviet Union might be able to wait and act from a stronger position later. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 23, 1939, was therefore a cynical power deal. Officially, both sides committed themselves not to attack each other. But the secret additional protocol was decisive. In it, Germany and the Soviet Union divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was to be smashed between the two powers. The Baltic states, Finland and Bessarabia were also included in strategic planning. For the countries concerned, this treaty meant that their future was decided without them. Two dictatorships that hated each other ideologically agreed on territories, borders, and rule as if states were only pieces on a chessboard. For Hitler, the pact was a tactical triumph. He was able to attack Poland without immediately having to fear a war on two fronts against the Soviet Union. For Stalin, the pact was also useful, but in a different way. He gained time, moved the Soviet border to the west, and gained access to areas that had previously belonged to the Russian Empire or were considered a security buffer zone. Both sides believed that they were using the other. Both knew that the contract was not based on trust. It was not peace out of conviction, but a break before the next war. On September 1, 1939, Germany attacked Poland, and a few weeks later, on September 17, the Red Army marched into Poland from the east. The Polish government had already been badly hit. The army was desperately fighting against the German superiority, and now the country was being smashed from two sides. Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland. For millions of Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and other residents, a time of occupation, violence, deportation, and persecution began. The Soviet occupation was not identical with the German one, but it was brutal too. Political opponents, civil servants, officers, intellectuals, and supposedly unreliable groups were targeted. Deportations to the east, arrests, and the dismantling of Polish institutions became part of Soviet rule. A particularly dark symbol of this policy was the Katyn massacre in 1940. Thousands of Polish officers, police officers, and members of the elite were shot by the Soviet Secret Service. This act was not only aimed at individual people, but at the ruling class of a state. Those who want to rule a nation often first destroy those groups that carry memory, administration, education, and military organization. Katyn was later denied for decades and blamed on the Germans, although the responsibility lay with the Soviet side. Here, too, a pattern of Stalinist politics emerged. Violence was not only exercised, but then protected by lies. After the pact, Stalin further expanded his influence. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were initially put under pressure and incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940. Bessarabia was taken from Romania. Finland resisted Soviet demands, whereupon the Winter War broke out from 1939 to 1940. Stalin had apparently expected to be able to defeat Finland quickly, but the Finnish army put up fierce resistance. The Red Army showed great weaknesses in leadership, preparation, and coordination. Although Finland had to cede territories in the end, Soviet losses were high, and the world saw that the Red Army was less fearsome than its size suggested. This experience was also to influence Hitler. He later underestimated the Soviet Union in part because he saw its weaknesses, but not the depth of its resources and willingness to make sacrifices. Between 1939 and 1941, a strange relationship developed between Berlin and Moscow. Both states traded with each other. The Soviet Union supplied raw materials such as grain, oil, and metals, while Germany supplied machinery and industrial goods. This cooperation helped Hitler to secure his war economy against the British blockade. Stalin, on the other hand, hoped to prolong peace with Germany through economic relations and to gain time. But beneath the surface, the coming conflict remained inevitable. Hitler's ideology was aimed at the East. He wanted to smash the Soviet Union, exploit its territories, subjugate or expel its population, and destroy Bolshevism. The pact was never more than a tactical tool for him. Stalin recognized the danger, but at the same time he overestimated his ability to control Hitler or at least delay the time of war. In the spring of 1941, warnings of a German attack increased. Diplomats, intelligence services, military and foreign sources provided clues. German troops were massed on the Soviet border. But Stalin distrusted many warnings. He considered them in part to be provocations by Great Britain, which wanted to draw the Soviet Union into the war against Germany. In addition, he apparently believed that Hitler would not start a war in the East until Great Britain was defeated. In its own strategic logic, a German attack in 1941 seemed unreasonable. But Hitler did not act according to Stalin's logic. He acted according to his ideological and military program. This miscalculation had catastrophic consequences. Stalin forbade long measures that could have provoked Germany. The Soviet troops on the border were not sufficiently prepared, many units were unfavorably positioned, command channels were cumbersome, and the leadership was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Officers knew that acting independently could be dangerous. The purges had created a military culture in which political caution was often more important than a clear assessment of the situation. Thus, Stalin's mistrust, his diplomacy of gaining time and the consequences of his own terror combined to form a dangerous weakness. On June 22, 1941, Germany began the attack on the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest land attack in history. Millions of German soldiers and their allies crossed the border. The Wehrmacht advanced at enormous speed, destroyed Soviet aircraft on the ground, surrounded entire armies, and brought the Soviet Union into an existential crisis. This was a shock for Stalin. The man who had so often deceived and tactically outplayed others had now become the victim of a strategic deception himself. The pact, which was supposed to buy him time, had enabled Hitler to wage war in the West and then turn against the Soviet Union with full force. The first days and weeks of the war were devastating for the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner, huge territories were lost, cities were threatened, and the population experienced a new form of war that was even more brutal than much before. The German attack was no ordinary campaign. It was an ideological war of annihilation. The National Socialist leadership regarded Slavs, Jews, communists, and Soviet functionaries as enemies who could be disenfranchised, enslaved, or murdered. Behind the front, mass shootings, starvation policies, terror against civilians, and the systematic murder of the Jewish population began. The Soviet Union was fighting not only for territory, but for the survival of entire population groups. Stalin now had to mobilize the country he had previously terrorized. The people were supposed to fight for a state that had persecuted, expropriated, or intimidated many of them. But the German attack radically changed the situation. For many Soviet citizens, the war became a defense of their homeland, family, city, village, and their own lives. Stalin understood that pure communist slogans would not be enough. Propaganda now spoke more strongly of the fatherland, of Russian history, of national defense, and of the fight against the fascist invader. The war became the Great Patriotic War. This turn of events showed Stalin's political instinct. He knew that people die not only for ideology, but for home, memory, and the feeling that everything they love is behind them. The Hitler-Stalin Pact remains one of the most controversial and momentous events in European history. It was not a coincidence, but the result of mistrust, power politics, and strategic calculation. Stalin wanted to buy time, shift borders, and keep the Soviet Union out of an immediate war. Hitler wanted a free hand against Poland and later better conditions for his attack in the East. For the countries between Germany and the Soviet Union, the pact meant submission, occupation, and violence. For Europe, it opened the way to the Second World War. For Stalin, he finally became a bitter trap because he believed he could control the timing of the war, even though Hitler had long since decided to destroy the Soviet Union. At the end of this chapter, there is a Stalin who was both perpetrator and deceived. He had helped divide Eastern Europe, put pressure on states, had people deported and used violence as a tool of his security policy. But he had also underestimated the character of the Nazi war and ignored warnings that could have prepared his country better. The attack of June 22, 1941 tore the Soviet Union from the cynical calm of the Pact into a struggle for survival of unimaginable severity. From now on, it was no longer just about Stalin's power, no longer just about borders or zones of influence. The question was whether the Soviet Union itself would exist. And from this catastrophe Stalin was to form a new myth, the myth of the leader who led his country to victory through the darkest war, although many of the catastrophes of this path had also arisen from his own decisions. Chapter 13: The Great Patriotic War. The German attack of June 22, 1941 hit the Soviet Union with a force that was hardly imaginable even in a century of violence. Within a few hours, millions of soldiers of the Wehrmacht and its allies crossed the Soviet border. Airfields were bombed, tank formations advanced deep inland, communication lines collapsed, entire sections of the front fell into chaos. For Stalin, this attack was not only a military catastrophe, but also a personal defeat. He had ignored warnings, counted on gaining time, and believed that Hitler would not start the war against the Soviet Union at this moment. Now it became clear that the Pact of 1939 had not created security, but had only been a pause before the war of annihilation. The first few weeks were devastating. The Red Army lost huge amounts of material, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner by the Germans, and entire armies were surrounded. The Wehrmacht advanced towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. For many Soviet citizens, a world collapsed. For years, propaganda had proclaimed strength, vigilance, and invincibility, but now German troops were deep on Soviet soil. The consequences of Stalin's own purges became painfully visible. Many experienced officers were missing, others were intimidated and hesitant to act independently. In a system in which a wrong decision could be politically deadly, initiative had become dangerous. But the war demanded exactly that: quick decisions, clear responsibility, and courageous action. Stalin himself initially reacted shocked. In the first few days, he seemed paralyzed, as if the attack had destroyed his own idea of control. But this rigidity did not last long. Soon he took on the central role again. He became chairman of the State Defense Committee, People's Commissar of Defense, and Supreme Commander. In doing so, he concentrated the military, political, and economic leadership in his hands. The state was completely converted to war. Factories were evacuated, especially from Ukraine, Belarus, and Western industrial areas. Machines, workers, and engineers were taken to the east, to the Urals, to Siberia, to Central Asia. What seemed like a logistical miracle was at the same time an act of brutal necessity. Entire industries had to be taken out of the grip of the Germans and rebuilt in new places. The war that Hitler waged against the Soviet Union was no ordinary war of conquest. It was planned from the beginning as an ideological war of annihilation. National Socialist racial ideology, anti-communism, and colonial fantasies of the living space in the East combined to form a policy of deprivation of rights, exploitation, and mass extermination. Behind the fronts, Einsatzgruppen murdered Jews, communists, functionaries, and other people marked as enemies. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war died of starvation, disease, shootings, and neglect. Entire villages were burned down, partisan areas were covered with terror, cities were starved. For the Soviet Union, this war therefore meant not only the fight for borders, but the fight against an occupation policy that regarded large parts of the population as inferior. Stalin realized that the population could not be mobilized with communist slogans alone. The war was called the Great Patriotic War, a term deliberately reminiscent of previous Russian defensive wars. Now it was not only about Marxism, party, and socialism, but about homeland, earth, family, language, memory, and survival. Stalin had national history invoked more strongly, reminding us of Alexander Nevsky, of Kutuzov, of the resistance against Napoleon. Even the Russian Orthodox Church was given a little more space again, because it was able to contribute to moral mobilization. This showed Stalin's tactical thinking. He was willing to shift ideological accents if it served the power and survival of the state. The Battle of Moscow became the first major turning point. In the autumn of 1941, German troops were dangerously close to the capital. Panic spread, authorities were partially evacuated, and many believed Moscow could fall. However, Stalin decided to stay in the city. This decision had enormous symbolic significance. If he had left Moscow, the signal would have been devastating. On November 7, 1941, he even had the traditional parade held on Red Square while the front was not far away. Soldiers marched before the eyes of the leadership, and some went directly to the front. The message was clear: the state will not give way. The capital is fighting. The Soviet counterattack outside Moscow in the winter of 1941 showed for the first time that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Cold, overstretched supply lines, Soviet resistance and fresh troops from the east stopped the German advance. For Stalin, this was a political and psychological victory. But he also drew risky conclusions from this. At the beginning of 1942, he believed that the Red Army could go on the offensive on several fronts. Many of these attacks failed with high losses. Stalin slowly learned that will alone does not replace strategy. In the course of the war, he began to give more space to capable military officers such as Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Konstantin Rokossovsky, even though he never relinquished political control. The decisive turning point was Stalingrad. The city on the Volga bore Stalin's name and was therefore of enormous symbolic importance, but its strategic importance was just as great. It was located on important transport routes and was a gateway to the resources of the South. In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht advanced towards the Caucasus and Volga. In Stalingrad, a battle of unimaginable severity developed. House after house, floor after floor, cellar after cellar was fought. The city was reduced to rubble, but the Soviet defenders held on. For Stalin, a retreat was hardly conceivable. The order not to retreat a step reflected the brutal logic of war. Discipline was enforced with severity, but at the same time a real will arose among the defenders to break the German advance. With Operation Uranus, the Red Army succeeded in encircling the German Sixth Army in November 1942. The victory of Stalingrad in February 1943 was more than a military success. It was a signal of world politics. For the first time, a large German army was completely destroyed or captured. The myth of German unstoppability was shattered. In the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of sacrifice, steadfastness, and retribution. For Stalin, this victory enormously strengthened his authority. The catastrophes of 1941 increasingly receded into the memory behind the triumph of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was followed in 1943 by the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. The Soviet leadership was better prepared than in the early years of the war. Defensive positions were staggered deeply, reserves were planned, German intentions were assessed more precisely. The Wehrmacht could no longer develop its offensive power as before. After Kursk, the strategic initiative was finally transferred to the Red Army. From then on, it pushed the German troops back step by step. The liberation of Ukraine, the advance into Belarus, Operation Bagration in 1944, and finally the road to Poland and Germany showed the formidable military power that the Soviet Union had developed despite all the losses. But the Soviet victory was associated with incredible sacrifices. Millions of soldiers died, millions of civilians were murdered, starved to death, froze to death or perished in bombings, occupation terror and deportations. Entire regions were devastated. Leningrad was besieged and starved for years. The population survived under conditions that can hardly be described. Hunger, cold, and death became everyday life, and yet the city held out. For the Soviet Union, the war was a national tragedy of hardly measurable proportions. Almost every family was affected. The victory of 1945 was therefore experienced not only as a political success, but also as redemption after suffering that burned itself deeply into the collective memory. Stalin knew how to use this victory politically. He was stylized as the supreme victor, the great general, the father of the nations, who had led the country through the trial. Propaganda portrayed him as a calm, wise driver. But the reality was more contradictory. Stalin had made serious mistakes, ignored warnings, weakened the army before the war, and made decisions in the first years of the war that cost many lives. At the same time, he showed his ability to learn, perseverance, and organizational toughness in the course of the war. He was able to mobilize enormous resources, relocate industry to the east, form alliances with Britain and the United States, and finally carry Soviet power all the way to Berlin. It is precisely this mixture that makes his role so difficult historically. He was one of the causes of early catastrophes and at the same time the leader of the state that played the largest part in the victory over Hitler's Germany in Europe. Relations with the Western Allies were characterized by mistrust from the beginning. Stalin needed weapons, trucks, food and materials, which came from the USA and Great Britain through aid programs. At the same time, he pushed for a second front in the West to relieve the Red Army. Churchill and Roosevelt needed the Soviet Union because without it a victory over Germany would hardly have been conceivable. But behind the joint war effort were already the conflicts of the post-war period. Stalin thought in terms of security zones, spheres of influence and political control. The further the Red Army advanced to the west, the clearer it became that it would not only liberate, but also create future power relations. The final battle for Berlin in the spring of 1945 was the symbolic conclusion of this huge war. The Red Army reached the capital of the German Reich and fought a fierce urban battle there. At the end, the Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. Hitler was dead, Germany capitulated, Europe lay in ruins. For the Soviet Union, the victory was a moment of immeasurable pride, but also of immeasurable sorrow. People celebrated, cried, searched for relatives, returned to destroyed villages or remained missing forever. At the end of this chapter, Stalin is at the height of his fame. The war had not weakened his rule, but turned it into a new myth. The dictator, whose policies had terrorized millions of people in his own country, became the savior of the nation in the official memory. Many Soviet citizens actually associated him with victory, because his image was present everywhere and because the experience of the German War of Annihilation overshadowed any earlier bitterness. But beneath the splendor of victory lay the shadows of his responsibility. The Great Patriotic War was a struggle of the Soviet people, soldiers, workers, peasants, women, partisans, and children, who made unimaginable sacrifices. Stalin was at the forefront of this struggle, but he was not its sole hero. The victory belonged to millions of people, many of whom had suffered under two powers, Hitler's attack and Stalin's state. This is precisely the deep tragedy of this chapter. The Soviet Union defeated a murderous dictatorship from the outside, while it continued to be ruled by a dictatorship from within. Chapter 14: From Victory to Superpower. When World War II ended in Europe in May 1945, the Soviet Union was outwardly victorious, but internally it was a wounded country. The price of victory was hard to comprehend. Cities lay in ruins, villages were burned, factories destroyed, railway lines torn apart, fields devastated, and millions of families had to mourn the dead, missing, or injured. The war had brought the Soviet Union to the brink of annihilation, but in the end Soviet soldiers stood in Berlin. For Stalin, this victory meant more than military triumph. It meant the final confirmation of his power and his historical role. In the official version, he had saved the country, directed the armies, and overthrown fascism. The catastrophes, wrong decisions, and victims, which had also been caused or exacerbated by his own policies, disappeared behind the image of the great victor. The immediate post-war period was marked by a deep contradiction. After the years of horror, many people hoped for relief, perhaps even for a milder order. Soldiers had seen Europe, had come into contact with other ways of life, had experienced camaraderie, suffering, and death. Many believed that a state that had been saved by such sacrifices now had to place more trust in its citizens. But Stalin thought otherwise. For him, the victory did not mean relaxation, but new vigilance. Anyone who survived the war was not automatically a hero of socialism. Soviet prisoners of war who returned from German captivity were often treated with suspicion. In Stalin's logic, captivity could already mean suspicion. Had they surrendered? Had they been influenced? Had they had contact with the enemy? Many returnees were checked, humiliated, sent to labor camps, or socially disadvantaged. Even the suffering of the war did not protect against the distrust of the state. The reconstruction required enormous efforts. The destroyed areas in the west of the Soviet Union had to be reorganized. Factories were rebuilt, fields cultivated, cities built, and millions of people had to find their way back to civilian life from evacuation, frontline service, occupation, camps, or forced labor. But the reconstruction took place under the conditions of the Stalinist system. The state set priorities, and these were again strongly focused on heavy industry, armaments, and strategic strength. The everyday life of the population remained hard. Housing was scarce, food was limited, and many people lived in ruins or temporary shelters. The victory brought fame, but not immediate prosperity. The Soviet population had defeated Hitler's Germany, but they continued to suffer deprivation. Stalin used the victory to lead the Soviet Union into a new position of world power. Before the war, the country had already been a great power, but after 1945 it finally became one of the decisive powers on Earth. The Red Army was located in Central and Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the eastern part of Germany were in the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin regarded these areas not only as booty, but as a security zone. The Soviet Union had been attacked from the West several times in history, and the German War of Annihilation had taken this security thinking to the extreme. From Stalin's point of view, it should never again be possible for an enemy army to advance unhindered deep into Soviet territory. That is why he wanted states on the western border that were politically reliable, militarily dependent, and ideologically controllable. For the people in Eastern Europe, this meant that liberation from German occupation did not lead to real self-determination in many places. National Socialist rule ended, but Soviet influence increasingly took its place. Initially, coalition governments were formed in some countries, but gradually communist parties prevailed, supported by Soviet power, security apparatuses, political purges, and control of the police and administration. Opponents were eliminated, independent parties were restricted, the media were brought into line, and elections were manipulated or politically controlled. The development was not the same everywhere, but the result was similar. Eastern Europe became a bloc of states subordinate to the Soviet Union. Stalin did not create a loose protective belt, but a political empire. Germany became the central arena of the new order. The defeated country was divided into occupation zones, and Berlin itself was deep in the Soviet zone, but also remained divided into sectors. The cooperation of the Allies, which had been necessary during the war, increasingly broke down. The USA, Great Britain, and France wanted to stabilize the western part of Germany economically and reorganize it politically. Stalin wanted to prevent a strong Western-oriented Germany from becoming a threat again. At the same time, he wanted to retain influence on the German question. The Berlin blockade of 1948 and 1949 showed how quickly the former alliance turned into open confrontation. The Soviet Union blocked the land routes to West Berlin in order to put pressure on the Western powers. They reacted with the airlift and supplied the city from the air. In the end, Stalin had to give up the blockade. But the division of Germany was deepened. The mistrust of the former Allies gave rise to the Cold War. This war was not cold because it was harmless, but because the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, avoided a direct military clash for the time being. Instead, they fought through alliances, propaganda, intelligence services, proxy conflicts, economic pressure, ideological competition, and an increasingly dangerous arms race. Stalin continued to see the world as a struggle between systems. Capitalism did not appear to him as a permanently peaceful opponent. but as a hostile order that threatened the Soviet Union. The United States, in turn, viewed Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe as evidence of aggressive intentions. Both sides interpreted the measures of the other as a danger and thus justified their own rearmament. A decisive step towards becoming a superpower was the Soviet atomic bomb. With the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the USA had shown that a new era had begun. Stalin immediately understood that a state without nuclear weapons could be blackmailed in the New World Order. The Soviet Union therefore accelerated its own nuclear program. Scientists, intelligence, and enormous government resources were used to catch up with the American lead. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. This ended the American nuclear monopoly. For Stalin, this was a huge strategic success. The Soviet Union was now not only a land power with a huge army, but a nuclear superpower. At the same time, a new level of global threat began. The next Great War could no longer have destroyed only cities, but entire civilizations. Domestically, Stalin remained tough and suspicious after 1945. The victory did not lead to an opening, but to new ideological control. Culture was monitored, artists and scientists had to comply with the state's requirements, and contact with the West became increasingly suspicious. The campaign against so-called cosmopolitanism particularly affected intellectuals and Jewish cultural workers. The state demanded patriotic loyalty, Soviet orthodoxy, and subordination to the party. Although the war had integrated Russian patriotism more strongly into Soviet ideology, this national component remained under Stalin's control. It was intended to strengthen power, not to enable free memory. The party itself also remained a space of fear. Although the terror after 1945 did not reach the same nationwide impact as in 1937 and 1938, the possibility of arrest, purging, or humiliation remained. Functionaries knew that Stalin's favor was uncertain. Old merits do not provide lasting protection. The so-called Leningrad case at the end of the 1940s showed that even high party cadres could be destroyed if they appeared as possible centers of power. Stalin did not tolerate independent loyalties. The war had made many military leaders famous, especially Marshal Zhukov. After the war, they were also viewed with suspicion or politically pushed back. Fame was useful as long as he served Stalin. If it became too big, it could become dangerous. During this time, the Soviet Union presented itself as the leading power of socialism and the protecting power of the oppressed peoples. Anti-colonial movements, communist parties, and left-wing intellectuals around the world looked to Moscow. The victory over Hitler gave the Soviet Union moral weight. Many people in the West underestimated or suppressed the violence within the system. Others saw very well that the Stalinist order was based on coercion, but considered the Soviet contribution to the defeat of National Socialism to be so historically significant that they found it difficult to classify the contradiction. Stalin benefited from this ambivalence. He was able to present himself as the victor over fascism, while suppressing freedom in his own sphere of influence. The Korean War from 1950 onwards showed that the Cold War was becoming global. Although Soviet troops did not fight openly in the same way as the armies of North Korea or China, the Soviet Union played an important role in the background. The world was now divided into blocks, and conflicts in Asia, Europe, or later other regions were charged by the antagonism between the communist and Western camps. Stalin had thus helped to create a post-war order in which almost every international crisis could become part of a larger systemic struggle. At the end of his life, Stalin ruled over a superpower, but not over a free or healed society. The Soviet Union had won the war, brought Eastern Europe under its influence, developed the atomic bomb, and established itself as a counterweight to the USA. But internally, it remained marked by fear, control, lack, and ideological narrowness. The victory had not made Stalin any milder. He had strengthened his conviction that toughness, mistrust, and central control were historically successful. For him, history seemed to have proven that sacrifice is necessary, violence is effective, and power is only secure if it accepts no borders. Thus, The destroyed country of 1945 became a superpower within a few years. But this superpower stood on a foundation of blood, coercion, and tremendous deprivation. The Red Army had helped liberate Europe from National Socialism, but no real freedom arose in the countries of its sphere of influence. The Soviet people had made an unimaginable contribution to victory, but they did not receive a state that trusted them in return. Stalin was at the peak of his power, but that summit was cold and lonely. The larger his empire became, the stronger his mistrust remained. The more he was revered as a victor, the less he could tolerate a world in which people acted independently of him. The Soviet Union was now a superpower. But it was a superpower in the shadow of a man who could never separate victory over external enemies from the search for internal enemies. Chapter 15: Death, Inheritance, and Shadow to the Present. At the end of his life, Stalin was no longer just a leader. He had become a political symbol, a figure whose picture hung in offices, schools, factories, barracks, and homes. His name was written on cities, businesses, medals, and newspaper pages. In the official narrative, he was the great victor of the war, the architect of socialism, the wise teacher of the peoples, and the infallible heir of Lenin. But behind this facade lay another realm, a realm of fear, silence, and destroyed lives. Millions of people had suffered under his rule, starved to death, were shot, deported, or disappeared in camps. Entire families had been torn apart by mistrust, denunciation, and state violence. As Stalin grew older and older in his last years, his power remained enormous, but at the same time it was increasingly characterized by paranoia and personal isolation. Stalin lived increasingly shielded from the society over which he ruled. His closest associates were powerful men, but even they could never feel safe. They knew too well the mechanism of his rule. Whoever sat at the table today could disappear tomorrow. Anyone who was praised yesterday could suddenly be considered a traitor. This uncertainty was not a coincidental side effect, but part of the system. Stalin ruled by closeness and fear at the same time. He kept his subordinates waiting, watched them, humiliated them, checked their reactions, and kept them in constant dependence. Even at the top of the state, there was no real security. Under Stalin, power did not mean freedom, but constant danger. In recent years, his mistrust has increased further. This became particularly clear in the so-called doctors' conspiracy at the beginning of the 1950s. Several doctors, many of them of Jewish origin, were accused of wanting to assassinate leading Soviet politicians. The accusations were fabricated and fit into an atmosphere of growing anti-Semitic and anti-Western campaigns. The affair could easily have become a new major wave of persecution. Many people feared that Stalin was preparing another purge shortly before his death. The memory of the Great Terror was still vivid enough to know what such accusations could mean. Again, the state seemed to invent an internal enemy. Again, medicine, science, and everyday life were transformed into political suspicion. Stalin's death came in March 1953. After a stroke, he lay seriously ill in his dacha. The circumstances of his last hours show the oppressive logic of his system. For fear of disturbing him without permission, his guards and employees were initially reluctant to intervene immediately. A man who had terrified millions of people ended up being surrounded by the fear he had created. Nobody wanted to make a mistake. No one wanted to act too early, no one too late. No one wanted to take responsibility when Stalin himself might wake up and show anger. So the fear he had forced on others became part of his own dying. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The news shook the Soviet Union. Many people actually cried. This may seem difficult to understand from today's perspective, but it shows how deep propaganda, war experience, habit, and emotional attachment could be. For millions, Stalin was the man whose name was associated with the victory over Hitler. Many had never heard anything but praise, reverence, and gratitude. Others cried out of fear of the future, out of uncertainty, or because public mourning was expected. Still others felt secret relief, but were not allowed to show it. In apartments, camps, and hearts there was a second silent reaction. Perhaps the worst was now over. Perhaps the state would no longer reach out to its own citizens in the same way. After Stalin's death, the struggle for succession began immediately. Men like Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, and others tried to secure their positions. Beria, the powerful head of the security apparatus, was particularly feared. He knew too much, controlled too much, and had too many enemies. He was soon arrested and later executed. This showed that even after Stalin, violence as a means of power had not disappeared. But at the same time it became clear that no one from the leadership wanted a return to the unbridled terror of a single all-powerful ruler. The men who had survived Stalin were themselves afraid of a new Stalin. The most important turning point came in 1956 with Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. There he criticized Stalin, especially the cult of personality, the purges, and the violence against party members. This speech was a shock. For the first time, it was openly stated within the Soviet center of power that Stalin had committed serious crimes, even if criticism remained limited and many fundamental questions of the system were not fully touched. Khrushchev attacked Stalin, but he did not question the entire history of Bolshevik rule. Nevertheless, a phase of de-Stalinization began. Some prisoners were released from camps, sentences were reviewed, names were rehabilitated, and the public image of Stalin was corrected. For many survivors, this change came too late. Those who had spent years in the Gulag may have received a paper that confirmed their innocence, but did not return lost youth. Those who had lost relatives sometimes only now received indications of their fate. The dead did not return. The fear did not immediately disappear from people's minds. People who had learned to remain silent for decades could not suddenly speak freely. Entire families had hidden their memories, destroyed photos, failed to name names, and concealed the truth from children in order to protect them. De-Stalinization opened doors, but it could not simply heal the psychological and social damage. Stalin's legacy remained contradictory and contested. On the one hand, there was the memory of industrialization, victory in the Second World War, and the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower. For some people, Stalin embodied strength, order, and national greatness. In particular, the victory over Hitler's Germany was perceived by many families as a sacred part of their own history. Since Stalin was associated with this victory in official memory for decades, his image remained not only negative for many. On the other side were the victims: the famines, the Holodomor, the deportations, the Great Terror, Katyn, the Gulag, the destroyed peasantry, the oppressed peoples, the murdered party members, the broken families, and the culture of silence. It is precisely this tension that explains why Stalin still works today not only as a historical figure, but also as a political symbol. It stands for the question of whether power can be justified by results. Can industrialization excuse the suffering with which it was enforced? Can victory in war cover up crimes at home? Can a state that defeats an external threat at the same time be an unjust state towards its own citizens? The honest answer is uncomfortable. Yes, history can contain such contradictions. A regime can play a decisive role in the defeat of an even more murderous enemy and at the same time act criminally itself. This is precisely why Stalin must neither be trivialized nor explained in a one-dimensional way. Stalin was not a demon outside of history. He was a person marked by poverty, violence, revolution, underground, war, and power struggle. But these imprints do not take away any responsibility from him. He made decisions. He had people deported, shot, starved, imprisoned, and persecuted. He created a system in which fear became a political language. His rule shows how dangerous an ideology can become when it considers itself infallible, how destructive a state becomes when it accepts no borders, and how easily people become tools when a supposedly great goal is placed above every single life. Stalin's shadow, therefore, extends far beyond the year of his death. It lies in the archives, in mass graves, in the memories of families, in the political cultures of mistrust, and in the question of how societies deal with a violent past. Memory is never neutral. Anyone who sees Stalin only as a strong leader ignores the victims. Anyone who describes him only as a monster overlooks the historical conditions that made his rise possible, and perhaps learns too little from them. It is important to think of both together, the structures and the responsibility, the circumstances of the time and the personal decisions, the construction and the destruction, the victory and the terror. In the end, Stalin remains one of the darkest and most consequential figures of the 20th century. He turned the Soviet Union into an industrial and military power, but he did it with methods that disenfranchised and exterminated millions of people. He led the country to victory in the war against Hitler, but he had previously weakened it through purges, mistrust, and violence. He spoke of socialism and liberation, but his state was based on coercion, surveillance, and fear. His death ended his personal reign, but not immediately the world he had created. The history of Stalin is therefore more than a biography. It is a warning. It shows what happens when power controls itself, when truth is ordered by the state, when people are sorted according to utility, and when fear is considered a tool of politics. It reminds us that progress without humanity can turn into barbarism. And to this day, it asks a question that every generation has to answer anew. How do you prevent a state from destroying the people of the present in the name of a great future?